we would, we'll get this meeting back to order. I know. So we'd like to welcome everybody back. Appreciate you coming in a little bit early. So I think as we get started back on this conversation on collection of sales tax from remote sales, just want to again reiterate, the question is, in our current tax system within the state, when an individual is eligible, or if it's a non-taxable event. So if I were a tribal member living on the reservation and I purchased something from an online vendor, how then can I be exempt from the tax that is due me? And so that's kind of the conversation committee we're trying to get our heads around is what's the mechanism there so that either the vendor can, by virtue of the sales made, the vendor can look at the address to which it's being sent and determine, similar to what South Dakota does, and they're just ahead of us on GIS stuff, similar to that. Or if I'm the purchaser, what can I do to claim an exemption or to claim a reimbursement? And that brings us then back, Brett, to your comments on your slide presentation. And if I may, I'd like to, we're done with that presentation. We're kind of in the question mode to Brett there. And I, in fairness to the committee, I identified a couple of things as I was looking at this, particularly on the streamlined sales tax certificate exemption, which I understand is an agreement between us and other states. But we need to make sure that it's user friendly. So if I am a tribal member and I'm looking at this streamlined sales tax exemption, how would I know that I could? Now, you tell us what you recognize, but there's nothing that indicates here for me. I'm not a tribal government. I may not be a business, but where do I fit in? And so I worry that there could be frustration on the part of an individual who is trying to get that they wouldn't know how to fill it out. And my question then for the rest of the committee's benefit is, I assume then that you would be able to make some recommendations back to Streamline to include that, something of that nature, to say, or tribal member, and then get the information to verify that. Is that?
Mr. Chairman, again, Brenda Henson, Department of Revenue. That's true. We can offer suggestions to the format as stated. There are other states that would need to consider that. I think one of the things that has somewhat confused this is that some of those other states that have reservations, they also impose the tax. So in those cases, there's no need to fill out the certificate of exemption. And so because those sales are still taxable. So it really depends on the state and the statutes and how that agreement is put in place. But we would be happy to share the suggestion with Streamlined and see about having that edited. There may be other exemptions that it's time that there be clarifications as well because of court cases or legislative changes. So we'd be happy to share that.
So, and I'll ask this question as well, if I may, Director Henson, is that in South Dakota, they have a GIS system that identifies their 5 reservations. They collect sales tax, but the sales tax depends upon the agreement they have with the state, as I understand it. And so when a vendor, a seller makes a transaction with a purchaser, they can go to that map or that form they have and type in the address, and it'll tell them what the tax rate is based on, because it would be dependent upon the reservation, as I understand it. But my understanding is we don't have that type of GIS system currently available in the state of Wyoming. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, but I think another piece that's really an important piece of this is as you mentioned, the reason for that database in South Dakota is to get the rate. It's not to determine whether it was a taxable event or not. It's simply to get the rate. And so, but I think a joint effort between the state of Wyoming, where addresses, where products are delivered, I think that addresses for all types of different services, not just taxation, but having clear, a clear authoritative source as to which addresses are within the boundaries of the reservation and which are not. I think that there's a broad need for that in Wyoming.
And so, Director Henson, I think my understanding is probably the cleanest or the most extensive address GIS system is Fremont County. But at best, I think their addresses for tribal members for tribal lands is about 50 to maybe 70% accurate or complete.
Okay.
And for fee land is probably 95 to 98%. Does that sound like numbers?
Mr. Chairman, that sounds reasonable. It just depends on the county as far as a statewide effort
No, but just-
related to that. But if you're specific to here, state of Wyoming's not the source of any of that information. It's all gathered at the local level. So whether it be at the county or at the municipal level, that's where, for example, Riverton assigns their own site addresses, and then outside, in the county areas, I believe that it's the county agency, whether it's a planning agency, that assigns those addresses.
Assessor.
It's the assessor that's assigning addresses, which brings up another question.
So I'm getting a head shake here.
Okay.
Let's just make sure
Okay.
I don't
But
lie
the
to you. So
only question I have then is the assessor's responsibilities are only to identify, value, and locate taxable property.
I said assessor's planner. It's
Okay.
planner. That's who I
Okay.
talked to yesterday. So
Okay.
thank you, Mr. Anderson. So we welcome to the table Jim Anderson, Fremont County Treasurer, who will answer some questions. So committee, any other questions as we identify kind of the status of Fremont County?
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
one thing we haven't quite addressed is right now, I know it's in your rules and in your guidance that the person be enrolled in a tribe to claim the exemption. I think we do need to at some point figure out how that works and what the Supreme Court ruling says in light of like subsequent acts of Congress. If that applies regardless if you're enrolled or not. I mean, you might be an Indian who's, got lineal descendancy and is eligible for membership, but not technically enrolled. I do think we need to take a closer look at that. And I don't know if you're in your research, if you had a chance to do that before this hearing.
So, Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Ellis, the only piece, we have one paragraph in our rules, and it does state enrolled members, and it's guidance for vendors and when, how they should treat a certificate and then provide that exemption. But certainly we could explore that. We have not had a request to open up our rules related to that. And as you know, there's nothing in statute that is specific to that taxable event when it's a tribal member. So definitely, I think we need to do some additional research. I believe, and Brett, correct me if I'm wrong, I do think the language enrolled tribal members is used in other states significantly, overwhelmingly. So there's opportunity there for us to reach out, I guess.
So Director Hanson, following up on that, Brett talked about that they had to be enrolled members of these two tribes. So if I were a tribal member living on the reservation and my wife were an enrolled member of a tribe from another state, she would not be eligible?
With our current rules, that is correct.
Is that in state statute
No,
or
that's our interpretation.
clarify that for me? I'm not tracking.
Perhaps. Brett,
Mr. Chairman, Brett Fanning, Excise Tax Administrator, Wyoming Department of Revenue.
Yes,
So
you are.
Director Henson is correct. So in order to qualify for that exemption, yes, it would be the enrolled tribal member that would need to put forth that.
But my question, is that a Wyoming statute that governs that, or is that a federal guideline?
Mr. Chairman, so that is our interpretation based on United States Supreme Court decisions. And it is very consistent with the research that I found that it does be an enrolled tribal member. Now, not every state has that distinction. Not every state does, but in my research, the majority of them, it was kind of railed at that. It needed to be an enrolled tribal member kind of in that region. So, yes.
So could we ask you, Madam Chairman, could we ask you to send us that? Because my wife may be an enrolled tribal member, just not of the tribe on the reservation of which we're living.
Mr. Chairman, yes, we will do some additional research for you and get it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Question, Senator Case?
Maybe. Ms. Henson, Director Henson, I'm hoping maybe to understand a little bit more how other states do it. You mentioned South Dakota, which has so many reservations and all this thing. And I'm wondering if maybe we're going about this the wrong way. Because I think about how tribal governments really need revenue. The tribes on the Wind River Reservation are restricted more than other tribes in the country as to their capabilities to get revenue for tribal government. So I recall the 85-15% ruling on the, so what if we were to go, instead about worrying about what tribe someone belongs to, or if we just worried about jurisdiction and we actually collected tax from everybody and shared it with the tribal governments, so that sales tax would be collected on purchases that are next on the reservation, but they get to keep the money. And I'm kind of tagging on to the cigarette compact we've tried to talk about having, where we wouldn't worry about who purchases cigarettes. We'd worry about where the cigarettes are sold, and then where they're sold keeps the money. So the reservation cigarette revenues could be used for those programs and off. So is there room in this world, and are other states doing that?
So can I tag on to that question, Senator, before? Because I think that so then, if I understand correctly, that if the sales tax collected in Fremont County then is divided up, that 30% is divided up first amongst municipalities based on population. So you take, if the population of actual municipalities was 80% of the population, they'd get 80% of that part that comes back, and then the rest goes to the county. So if we considered doing this recommendation, it seems like you would want to have that as an organized, like, municipality, or how would that look?
Mr. Chairman, Director Henson. Well, it would be as if, perhaps it'd be as if it's another county. That's not what it means, but that the sales tax collections with a nexus on the reservation would be 100% shared with the reservation. There wouldn't be a population formula. And I know we can do this because Streamline sales tax does let us do this. I've been through this enough in those days. And what it means, if whoever, Arapaho, Shoshone, white person buying from Amazon on the reservation, delivered to a reservation address, the reservation governments get that sales tax. And it doesn't go through the county sharing mechanism.
Like so.
I'm asking if it's similar.
I'm wondering if that's similar to what other places do, because it seems a lot simpler
Mr.
and
Chairman,
beneficial to government.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, that is definitely a policy decision that the legislative body can address. That's part of that distribution. If it's deemed, as you stated, we had the municipal option tax that was recently passed. And that is a situation where if it's the sale occurs within that municipal boundary, X occurs, that percentage, whatever the case may be, that municipal option sales tax can be collected and distributed. That is definitely something that we can work with the committee, work with the legislature, but that could happen fairly easily, change the distribution.
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
I just, for the record, I think that could happen fairly easily from an administrative standpoint. I think clearly coming up with the percentages and all of that, lots to think about.
Right. And Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chairman, so it definitely, I mean, right now you've got members that have the benefit of claiming that exemption and not paying that amount. So I think it is incumbent on us to, determine if that is something that each of the tribes would be interested in that, perhaps we even tag on with the tobacco compact that we've already started those discussions, but not quite, gunned it yet. We haven't got there yet, but perhaps we expand that conversation and see if there's something that we can work out there. Certainly be willing to investigate.
So then, if we could, Mr. Anderson, if you could kind of walk us through just on the sales tax, we received a document on sales tax from remote sales tax collected for the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And the percentage coming then back to the county, what percentage of it comes to the county? And then can you just share with us, is there a distribution on that percent that comes back to the county, or what, how's that used?
Mr. Chairman, currently there is no additional distribution. The distribution happens at the Department of Revenue, where they distribute it out to the municipalities and then the remainder to the county. And so we use that as general fund revenues.
Have you seen that percentage to the county decreasing as the size of municipalities change, or has it stayed? Give us an idea of how that's.
That's a good question, Chairman. I guess I don't have figures exactly as far as what I can say over several years as population moves around. I can say that a bit of an aside, we were expecting, just as the state was, for sales tax to really tank with the whole pandemic thing a couple years ago. And the shiny side of all of that was these online retailers beginning to pay sales tax at about the same time. And so while we were anticipating a huge drop, just because anticipating statewide there was going to be a huge drop in sales tax, we actually saw an increase from the prior year in our sales tax receipts that we received from the Department of Revenue.
Okay. Questions? Any other questions? Okay. Then let's do some public comment. Chair, Councilman Spoonhunter. Sure.
Good afternoon, Chairman Larson, Chairman Ellis, and distinguished members of the Tribal Select. I just have a comment here. Listen to this is very interesting. It really is really good to a lot to take in, and my mind is going a mile a minute here. But the one factor that is not present at the table and in the discussions in all of this is that both tribes, the Wind River Tribal Council, reestablished the Wind River Tax Commission, which has members of Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribal members who oversee the taxes on the reservation and potential taxes. So I do believe that at some point, we would like to ask that the committee have a meeting with the current tax commission, the people that were just here and the gentleman here, and maybe with the Wind River Tax Commission, so they can continue to work on this and provide more dialogue so that we can continue this down in Laramie at the next meeting. So I just want to make that comment. Thank you all.
Thank you, Councilman Spoonhunter. And I'll just share with you, and I hope I'm saying this, I think so. That's the reason we brought this up and made it a topic to begin with, is we identified that this wasn't, that there's a potential here, and we wanted to get the information that we have from the Department of Revenue, get the information. And if the tribes are interested in pursuing this, then we'll facilitate that. If the tribes are not, then we'll just let the sleeping dog lay.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Mr. Chairman, and maybe just something to think about too. So as I've thought about this for the last several months, there are a couple of paths forward. One would be looking at some kind of an agreement similar to what happens in South Dakota, but that all kind of presumes that the tribes impose a sales tax that's similar to Wyoming's. So that's one option, but that requires some feedback from your tribes. The second would be, another cleaner option would be we exempt the reservation entirely. But I've got the revenue chairman from the Senate on my left, and I worry that he's burning a hole in my head right now by me saying that out loud. But so that's yet another option. And then the other one that's more difficult is, if we were to say to the Department of Revenue, we want you to drill down, use better mapping, use better technology to try and figure this out. I mean, that just seems like it doesn't seem as clean. I mean, there's a lot of unknowns, and it's an imperfect tax collection to begin with. So, I think a lot of what the tribes say and what their input is will kind of inform us of maybe the best path forward. But those are kind of the three ways that I see this, or doing nothing, which just means that if an individual tribal member wants to fill out that form every time they buy something online, then, that's all feedback we're looking for. Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, can I come on? Madam Chair, you just hit the nail on the dot right there. Is that we need to sit back down at the table, and whether it's mapping, going through different numbers. I heard the gentleman say it goes in general fund. We have a lot of tribal members who don't live on the reservation and who are subject to tax of the state of Wyoming. So let's sit down, let's have these conversations, let's start that dialogue. We are very open, as I can't speak for Eastern Shoshone, but as for Northern Arapaho, we are very committed to sitting down and doing the work on redoing the tax for as Northern Arapahos, but also as citizens of the state of Wyoming. So thank you.
Any other public comment? Councilman Harjo.
Good afternoon again, everyone. So my concern, there's been a lot of taxation on our oil and gas. And this is something that we had wanted to talk about. So recently we've taken over one of our oil and gas fields, but the money and the taxes before that came off our oil and gas fields, a lot of that money went to the schools in the state of Wyoming. And so my ask is going to be that the Northern Arapaho tribe and the Eastern Shoshone tribe get credit. They get credit for all the taxes that came off the reservation to help educate the students in the state of Wyoming. That's something that hasn't been said. That's something that the tribes have never been acknowledged for, is that a lot of our money went to the citizens of Wyoming in the form of children and their education. So I'd just like to ask that we get a report out, knowing where our monies for our taxation went. Which county did this portion of our taxes go? Which other county benefited from the taxes that came off the Wind River Reservation? So I'd just like to have an ask for recognition of that for the tribes. Thank you. Because we're talking about
So
millions of
Councilman Harjo,
dollars.
I think you and I need to schedule a meeting and go over the other ask where we're going to develop the questions. And then I want to make sure that I get this down correctly and let me go back to Director Henson with the right request, make sure that I'm getting it accurately for you. And then we'll follow up and perhaps try to have some information for you by October.
Okay, thank you.
That work?
And that, because that would really benefit the tribes. We really face a lot of discrimination and racism. There's a lot of stereotyping of our people that we receive free checks from the government. And it's really been held against us. And so that would be a form to show that we're not doing that.
Very good.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Case.
This committee, in previous years, I believe Patrick Goggles was co-chairman. We conducted a study of the balance of taxation and services provided and taxation. And so that study is available somewhere in the website archives. Our situation is slightly different than a lot of places because the state of Wyoming provides education services on the reservation. Funded, of course, with tax dollars, some mineral revenues. You know, it's mostly property taxes, including property tax off minerals, just like throughout the state. So when you think about that question, there's just a lot to unpackage there. It's not as simple an answer as you might think, because Fremont County has school districts on the reservation that are funded with those same dollars as the rest of the state. So I think if you got a copy of that study, it would be illuminating. And maybe it needs to be updated, but that was quite a while ago.
Thank you, Senator Case. And I guess that's the reason that I wanted to visit down with Councilwoman Harjo, is because I think that's what she's saying, that there's been revenues that have been generated on the reservation that have gone to educate the citizens of the state. And so we'll disappeared. We'll figure that out. So thank you. Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gary Collins for the record, Madam Chair, committee members. I think a couple of things. Number one is the tribes do not have a municipality. Therefore, we don't share in any of the distribution of the sales tax. And so just last week, the tribe distributed $5 million in over and above the regular kinds of things that we have in the past. And most of that money comes into Riverton to buy the basic goods, probably at Walmart or Smith's or whatever have you, restaurants. But so the city collects the tax and then they get the distribution back to the municipality equation. And so we as tribal members get chastised for using a city park that we don't pay for it, when in fact we have. So I don't know what the amount of money is generated based on tribal purchases in Riverton that turns around and comes back to the city and not to the tribe. So there's a misunderstanding, I believe, with the educational process that needs to occur and how those taxes are collected and how they're distributed and who benefits, because we don't benefit as much as we probably pay in. But I don't know that number, so we don't have any quote gripe to figure out what it is, because the numbers aren't there, visible.
So I think it's important. Again, I'm going to try and get us back up out of the weeds just a little bit, because this conversation really is on tax collected from internet sales, remote sales tax, and we're trying to have that exact discussion. Can we form a district or municipality with and have those revenues come back to the tribes if that's what the tribes want? And so we're recognizing some of those gaps that exist, but the conversation is not on the current sales tax structure that is and how that's distributed. And so I know that this is a long-standing conversation, but I'm trying to avoid getting down there in this conversation because we really do have a tight schedule.
Well, I appreciate that. But beyond that, the tribe is currently establishing a fiber optics line from Riverton clear up to Fort Washakie and beyond. So every home will have a chance to be hooked up to the internet. And when that happens, there'll be a lot more purchases occurring. And so we need to address that forthcoming surge of internet access by the fiber optics line we're establishing as infrastructure. So it's going to be bigger than we think today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Good to see you again too. Any other public comment? Okay. We are, look at this, 2:00, and we are on land and resources. Feral horse. Kit, I think we got you, and I don't know, Art, you're back with us, I believe, and we got fish and wildlife. I was just going to do. There will be directives with that. So, Kid, I'd like to just have you kind of take this discussion, if you will, and we'll have Art and everybody, and I apologize for not knowing, and that's why you'll introduce yourself and take us through the bill that provided some funding, and then talk about the wild horse management or feral horse management that we're trying to address here on the reservation and how that'd look.
Of course, Chairman Larson, members of the committee. So House Enrolled Act 45, it was passed last budget session. It allocated around $500,000 specifically to the governor's office for wild horse management initiatives. And the eligibility for those projects included conversations, of course, with other state entities, state governments, counties, municipalities, and specifically the tribal business councils and tribal game and fish. So through that, we had a discussion with Director Lawson, and we spoke with both tribal councils earlier in the spring after the session ended about, is there an opportunity for wild horse management on the reservation that could be fruitful and mutually beneficial for the state and the tribes? As I'm sure the director and others will speak about, there's an incredibly severe ecological issue with wild horse management, not only in the state, but on the reservation due to the presence of over 5,000 excess wild feral horses. So seeing the impact that
Kit, would you mind saying that number again? That's just here on the reservation. How many wild or feral horses?
I'll defer also to the director, but over 5,000, I believe. And that's probably a severe undercount. So the long story short, the fruit of those talks is Tribal Game and Fish submitted a proposal for wild horse management to our office earlier this year. And it allocates around $400,000 of that 500,000 for the removal of roughly 1,200 horses. Gather and removal using a helicopter procedure, and then a standard gathering technique. All those horses that are, of course, gathered on the reservation are property of the tribes. And then the tribes have the ability to sell those horses or get them back to owners, or they have an administrative process if people have dumped their horses on the reservation illegally. And then the revenues of that project under the agreement would come back to be reinvested in that program for further horse management. And there's 3 specific goals. First is to try and just get the population of wild feral horses down to, I believe it's the adequate management level, the correct management level population wise for that ecological habitat. There'll be a small portion remaining for aesthetic purposes. And then third, just maintain ongoing management activities. We've drafted that agreement. Both tribes and Tribal Game and Fish are looking at it and have looked at it. And I believe we've received positive feedback to date, and we're hoping we can get it finalized and signed as soon as possible for wild horse gather activities this fall. It's just getting through the administrative lawyers talking back and forth about provisions.
Well, I think we should start with Pat Nillick. He does all the research and everything. He's with US Fish and Wildlife. And so he has all the documentation and everything that we need.
Pat, welcome. Please. We do. We should have had materials. It was on your desk this morning, and then we've got the report that Beth Calloway provided for us that you were referring to in our handouts as well as the House Enrolled Act on wild horse management. So Pat, please introduce yourself.
Thank you,
And
Chairman.
Thanks for being here.
You bet. Thank you, Chairman, Co-Chair, and committee members. I'm Patrick Nelica. I work as a wildlife biologist and project leader for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service located in Lander. Our office is tasked with assisting the tribes with all things fish and wildlife related on the Wind River Reservation. And our office has been doing that for many years, since the inception of the Fish and Wildlife Service back in the 1940s. So a real productive relationship that we have with the tribes. And I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony today regarding feral horse survey work that we've been involved with. As has been expressed already, all of us are very familiar with the ecological issues that feral horses cause. And that's been occurring across the West, and Wind River is no different, as has been expressed already. In the 20 years that I've been in this office assisting the tribes, I've seen a significant increase in the number of feral horses on the reservation, along with all the resource degradation that comes along with an overabundance of feral horses and competition with livestock for forage, displacement of wildlife, et cetera, et cetera. Because of the issues with, the abundance of feral horses, there's interest in trying to get an estimate of the number of feral horses on the reservation. And has been mentioned previously, that estimate is around 5,000. That's a minimum count. And I can walk you through some of that. I don't want to take a lot of time, but so we did an aerial survey. When I say we, that's the Wind River BIA, as well as ART's office and our office collaborated together this past winter in January and February. And we basically flew this survey in a small plane and went across the entire reservation and counted as many horses as we could using this transect method. And we came up with an estimate of 5,004 counted. Again, that's just a minimum count. There are a proportion of horses that we're missing out there. But because horses are large in size and it's open country, we think we're counting the majority of horses, maybe anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 of the horses that are out there. That's our estimate. So again, 5,000 is the minimum count at that time in January and February. The material that was provided to you, I think on page 2, it does have a map that shows the location of all the different horse groups that occurred on the reservation. And then on page 3, it has what's called a heat map. And that just kind of takes that information and says, this is where the densest areas of horses are at. And the areas that are darkest red are the areas of highest concentration. And as you can see, a lot of those areas are relatively close to the reservation boundary. And so that is an issue. There are feral horses that are, moving off the reservation onto state jurisdictional lands in the East Fork area, on the Spence Moriarty Wildlife Habitat Management area, and other areas as well. Not that I'm aware of. The last point I wanted to make is that so in comparison to areas off the reservation on BLM administered lands, there's roughly the same number of horses. There's information in your packet that shows that in March of 2022, the BLM estimated they had about 4,700 horses on, yes, sir, on BLM administered lands in the state of Wyoming, but that's on about 5 million acres. The same similar number on the reservation is on about 1 million acres. And so again, that just shows you that the density of feral horses on the reservation is upwards of, in total, 5 times higher than what you would have on BLM administered lands in Wyoming. So just as a comparison. And then the last bit of material that we provided is just some background on feral horses. If you have an interest, it's a short article that came from the Journal of Wildlife Management. It's a professional journal for wildlife biologists, and it just has a nice synopsis of feral horse issues across the West. The one point I want to make from that article is that there's a disproportionate number of feral horses on Indian lands across the West. There are more on reservations than there are on BLM or Forest Service administered lands by a significant amount. So again, the issue that you're seeing on Wind River is not unique to Wind River. That's common across reservations across the West. So thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the question then is why? I mean, is it just because of the jurisdiction and the sensitivity of your agency getting out on the lands and doing the roundups and sterilization, all of that kind of stuff that the BLM normally does on BLM administered lands? And I know on BLM lands, it's more of a matter of resources and ability to get out there, but I'm just wondering why it's so much more disproportionately higher in Indian country.
Yeah, I guess I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I haven't been asked that question before. But certainly, and Director Lawson could speak to this, there's additional horses that are being dumped on the reservation, so to speak, as people don't want their horses anymore. That certainly has been occurring. There may be, cultural reasons because of Native individuals' ties to horses over, the last hundreds of years. That might be a factor in that too. I don't really know. My agency, Fish and Wildlife Service, we don't, we're not terribly involved in feral horse management. That's a BLM and a Forest Service issue. There are some feral horses on Fish and Wildlife Service refuges around the West, but not many. So our office is kind of unique in providing support to the tribal fish and game here and the tribes related to feral horses on Wind River. Our agency, as I mentioned, generally doesn't get involved in that to the degree that, say, BLM or Forest Service does.
Please.
So just a follow-up question. So are there any roundups ever done then on Wind River that are conducted by any federal agency, either BLM or Forest Service? And then are there any, the sterilization.
Yes.
Thanks. That happen off reservation. Is there any of that happens on reservation?
I can turn that over to Director Lawson.
There's no federal agencies assisting us on the roundups right now. We're just hiring tribal members as contractors to round up as many as they can.
How many do you think you've rounded up over, let's say, in the last 2 years, Mr. Lawson?
About a year and a half, we rounded up about 1,300.
Okay. Representative Blackburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you have any thoughts on the legislation that was being written and probably presented by Lisa McLean from Michigan? It's HR 7631, which allows combat veterans to hunt the wild horses with birth control darts. And how will that help us? And can we utilize that on the reservation?
That is a question for both councils to answer. They're in charge and they'd be able to answer that question. But yeah, it's something that would have to go through them.
Thanks.
So is there a prime time? I mean, Kit talked about doing it this fall. Is that the optimum? Is there a time of the year that you best look to round horses up, maybe when it's cooler, or how does that work, Art? And then also in that, these are feral. What percentage of those you referred that maybe some of them would be returned to owners? What percentage of roundup horses actually would the owners come back then and claim and say, there's my favorite steed who I lost in the winter storm of 09, and you know, can you give us some idea on that?
Right now, with the amount of horses that we have, it's a real small percentage that we find that are branded, but we do find horses branded from was it Ohio or Iowa and state from back east. So it does happen, and we do have a few people that used to live here where the horses broke down their fence and we ended up rounding them up. So it does happen. But with the amount of horses that we have, it doesn't happen that often. And yeah, like I said, they come from different states.
Does this includes this appropriation includes your ability to transport them to, I'm assuming Canada is where they're disposed of?
Yeah, Canada, Mexico, or who, like the Honor Farm or whoever wants to purchase them, the bigger numbers, so we can get them moved. And like they said, get it to a manageable number where we can also use them. One of our efforts is that when we get that number down, is start using we're trying to start an outfitting guide school on the reservation, and so if we could use some of the horses that we do round up.
Any other questions?
And Chairman Larson, just to note another part of that funding, not related to it'll be sent to the Honor Farm here for their participation in the BLM wild horse and burro management process. So that piece will be incorporated as well with the remaining funds from HEA 45.
Okay. All righty, public comment. Councilman Fast Horse. How good to see you. Yep.
Good afternoon, Chairman, Madam Chair, committee members. Good. This is Co-Chair Stephen Fasthorse for the record. And again, the Northern Arapaho Tribe, and I believe the Eastern Shoshone, we both support this effort because again, it is a huge undertaking and it's been a serious issue that we have been trying to wrestle with, forever. I mean, this goes back to decades of work and again, multiple efforts. I know the Bureau of Indian Affairs was involved in this effort a ways back. At one point, these efforts were handled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but again, through the years, their facilities and their abilities to manage, just dissolved basically, through lack of funding and budget cuts and different things. And so their facilities have really deteriorated to where we can't even use them at some point. And again, we had to figure and be creative on how we could be more effective and look at different ways. And this is something that, again, Director Lawson has been working on, extensively, and again, these issues range from the local highways of the reservation and the communities all the way out into the wilderness, and again, it's a very vast issue that affects each and every tribal member on the reservation, whether it comes to wanting to be out into recreation and wildlife, to hunting, and again, to everyday production, people that are ranchers and farmers, needing the lands to try and continue their operations. We've seen some very drastic changes in some of these range areas that make it impossible for anyone to use these lands that some of these horses have been on. And just like in the pictures of the maps there, where you can see some of these locations where it's really dense, those areas are being affected pretty bad. And again, I appreciate the fact that we have Pat with us because again, at the same time as we're looking at trying to figure and continue building this program, we also have Pat and Art looking at conservation on how we can look at how to remediate some of these areas once some of these numbers can be looked at and some of these issues be taken care of is how do we restore? How do we get some of these lands back to what they should be? And I like the comment that Director Lawson had mention, we have people that actually bring some of these horses specifically to our reservation, like as if we don't have enough. They want to give us more.
So Director Fast Horse, what is the manageable number that you're trying to get to?
I'd have to refer to Pat here to help us understand what is a more manageable number.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, that number hasn't been decided, and really that's a tribal decision in cooperation with the BIA. Certainly much less than 5,000.
So if we take in 5,000, you have 3,800, or you have 5,000, you take in 12, you have 3,800 left. What kind of repopulation numbers are you going to see? Are you going to see that many? Do you have? So if we get rid of that 1,200, how many colts, foals are we going to have this next spring?
Mr. Chairman, that's a good question. So feral horse populations typically can reproduce and double every 4 years. So essentially that's a 20% increase per year. You think it's 25%, but it's not. It's really 20%. But in 4 years, that population could double. So you're basically staying probably pretty even. One thing I will add is myself, the Tribal Fish and Game, the tribes, other folks that I've been working with, we're trying to generate other grant dollars that can assist the tribes in additional feral horse removal to the tune of, significant amounts of money that hopefully within the next 4 or 5 years, the population could be significantly reduced down to an appropriate management level that's more in tune with the resources. But again, the actual number of horses that are on the landscape, that's really a tribal decision. So I can't provide any more information here, sir.
Thank you. Very helpful. Councilman Fast Horse.
Chairman, just to finish again, the tribes are 100% behind these efforts. Again, we're very grateful that we have the help of the state, and that the state is looking at how they can be involved to help us with these efforts. Because again, as it's mentioned just now, we continue to be creative on how we can grow and come up with better ideas on how we maintain and manage in the future. Again, the grant funding is going to be very critical on how we can do so, because as you all know, as it is, as a tribal fish and game, they are severely underfunded, and again, we've had to be very creative as the two tribes on looking at how we set up fee structures and different things to be able to help offset some of those costs, to try and continue to figure how we can grow our capabilities. Because again, our game wardens are very limited pertaining to the size of the reservation that they have to, continue to manage and administer all of these things. These regulations, again, goes back to some of the encroachment issues, all of those things. Our department that oversees that is severely underfunded and undermanned, and so we constantly bang ideas off of each other to try and figure how we can be more effective to try and help Art Lawson and his program, even down to trail cams. Even one point we talked about drones, different things to try and figure the most cost-effective way to deal with some of these issues that continue to be a major issue for all of us. And so the tribes, we love to visit with Pat all the time. Again, we enjoy, again, just like every Wyomingite, we love our outdoors. We want to protect it. And that's why some of these main issues that we talk about always pertain exactly to that, is the conservation efforts and continuing to protect, Mother Earth. And again, like the trash issue we talk about. These things are all related. They're all related back to how we can continue to sustain and use conservation in a better way. So again, we appreciate you all, and thanks for everyone who got behind these efforts, and even the recommendations to help assist with the funding for this, because the helicopter is going to be very effective in helping us increase the bigger grab of some of those numbers and setting up these catch pens and being able to really show the difference in some of these herds. So thank you.
Any additional public comment? Okay. Is the livestock infectious disease control bill? Committee members, this is the bill that we passed last year that we ran out of time in the House. It went through the standing committee like the second to the last day of general file for the House of Origin. And we didn't have time to get it out along with some other bills the last day. So we're reviewing that. Heather's going to talk about, there was one recommended change in the standing committee from the livestock board that we reached out to our 2 tribal business councils, and they agreed that that was an acceptable amendment. And so she'll bring that to our attention, and if we can just kind of go through that quickly, and then we can take a vote on moving this forward for this year.
Thank you,
I think
Mr.
we have Director True online and Dr. Hadsel, if we have questions for him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The working draft before you is now in the 23 bill drafting system. So it's 23 LSO-0106, but this is virtually the same bill as what the committee saw last year. However, as memories being what they are, and my own included, I'll just go through the bill draft so that y'all know what it is. So this bill draft, it specifies that participation in livestock and contagious and infectious reportable disease testing and containment programs and reimbursements, that it includes all producers in the state, which also includes producers on the Wind River Indian Reservation as specified. And I'll get into the specification on the next page. And then it also provides for cooperative agreements should that between the state and Eastern Shoshone or Northern Arapaho tribes, if they find that to be appropriate. And then in introducing some of the conforming amendments, that there's expanding the governor's authority to negotiate on brucellosis containment. So this goes into the section of law in Title 11, which tends, most of Title 11 is agricultural related. And specifically, this is in the contagious and infectious reportable disease sections of that title, which is Chapter 19. So on page 2 at 11-19-101, this statute in particular deals with the duties of the state veterinarian and enforcement of some of these infectious disease measures, and it creates a new subsection D. This bill creates the new subsection D, where it specifically states that the state veteran may provide contagious and infectious reportable disease testing, containment, and reimbursement services under this chapter to any livestock producer in Wyoming. That's one of those statements that largely states the obvious, because the entire chapter is how these different programs work. And then it has the comment, including on the Wind River Indian Reservation, who a producer who agrees to comply with the applicable program requirements, rules, and any orders that are issued pursuant to the testing results or program requirements. Now, you may notice if you were following along and reading with me that I did skip the 2 words "in writing," because that is the on line 12 of page 2, because that is the amendment that the House Standing Committee last session, which was the Agriculture Committee, and through consultation with the chairman in this committee had determined that the agreement wouldn't need to be in writing, but just that someone, hey, you can participate in all these programs as long as you kind of adhere to what the programs are the confines of the programs, but it wouldn't need to be in writing. So on line 12, that is the standing committee amendment would have been, and I could have incorporated it, or the committee can direct me to incorporate, to strike or to delete "in writing" after the word "agrees." Then the rest of subsection D that is created, it indicates that services on the Wind River Indian Reservation under the subsection may also be provided pursuant to a cooperative agreement that is entered into by the Wyoming Livestock Board in consultation with the state veterinarian and either or both tribes. Then that is the new subsection D. The next change that this bill addresses is in 11-19-214 that it has a conforming amendment that what it does is it simply says, as you look at the top of page 3, that all livestock animals in Wyoming, and then this has a reference back to that new subsection D that we just created, so that all livestock animals in Wyoming, including those belonging to a producer on the Wind River Indian Reservation who receive services pursuant to that new subsection that we just read, that's found to be infected or exposed to tuberculosis. These are different sections of this infectious disease law. So what I'm glossing over is not to go so quickly, but just its existing law. So I was just describing that the conforming amendment is to insert reference to the new section. And that's the same with the statute 11-19-405. This is the conforming amendment that I mentioned about the governor with a brucellosis and maintaining the brucellosis free status, that the governor shall enter into negotiations with any relevant parties, including tribes of the regions adjacent to Wyoming. And that was to address there. Page 4, you will see that in section 11-19-406 is another reference back to the subsection that was created. So all cattle or domestic bison in Wyoming, including those that belong to a producer. And then this particular section is addressing brucellosis for that program. And then the bill concludes with just an effective date of being July 1st in 2023.
Any questions? Does that sound familiar? Long ago. Any public comment? Director True, are you on?
I am, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can't see you, but we can hear you.
That may not be all bad, Mr. Chairman.
We wasn't going to say anything.
There you go.
There you are. There you are.
Mr. Chairman, any questions for the agency?
We're just taking public comment. Is there anything new or enlightening that you need to share with us? If not, we'll just move along.
No, Mr. Chairman, we're good to go with bill as it was amended.
Thank you. Dr. Hassel, anything that you'd add to that?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. No, there is not.
Okay. Any other public comment? Stephen, please, or Councilman Fasthorse, I apologize.
Again, Co-Chairman Fasthorse, for the record, Northern Apple Tribe, Chairman, Co-Chair, Madam Chair, and committee members. Again, we as a tribe support this so long. Again, that was kind of the biggest hurdle, was to ensure that, again, if long as we had the same protections and the same relief that every Wyoming citizen is afforded, again, that would make these things workable, and we'll do the best we can to continue to be there to support this until its final passage. So we appreciate all the hard work that everybody has done to get the proper amendments in and make this workable. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Fasthorse. In fact, you're the one that brought this to our attention.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Committee, what's your pleasure on this bill? We move the bill.
Second.
And a second. Discussion on the bill. Any amendments to the bill? Let's walk through the bill. I think we walked through the bill. We need to move that amendment. Change that language. On page 2, is there maybe an amendment on line 12?
Thanks. Mr. Chairman, I move that on page 2, line 12, we remove the words in writing.
Any discussion? Is there a second? Thank you. Any discussion? Those in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Further discussion on the bill? Question on the bill, roll call, I believe.
Senator Case? Senator Salazar? Representative Blackburn? Representative LeBeau? Chairman Larson?
Aye.
Co-chairman Ellis? 5 ayes.
And Heather, that'll be a House bill again. Members of the committee, we had a request from the tribes to, in light of some conversation going on with the Supreme Court, which you heard Chairman Dresser talk about this morning about reconsidering the Indian Child Welfare Act, that in the event that the Supreme Court ruled that that act was no longer in effect, that what then would we as a state do, and how would we look at this? The chairman and I, Chairman Ellis and I both felt that this committee needed to have a little better understanding of what the Indian Child Welfare Act was, so that as if and when this conversation come up with our colleagues in the Senate and the House, that we would could be the subject matters if we have to adopt some a policy and state statutes to enforce the Indian Child or a similar act on a statewide basis. So that's the conversation we'll be having, and we're really fortunate enough. Claire Johnson had a professor at Michigan State that has agreed to join us online at 3, and so we want to be cognizant of her time, and then she's going to just share with us some ICWA 101. So I'd like to come back in about 1:45, and Mr. Ayers, you've got some information on St. Stephen's. We may get started on that. If you're not done, we'll cut you off and come back after our ICWA conversation, if you don't mind. And if we're able to get through it, then so be it. Okay. 1:45. So Mr. Ayers, we've asked the Department of Education if they could just provide an update and kind of a little bit of history on St. Stephen's. We appreciate you kind of working with our schedule on this with Professor Fort. But we also want to get you on the road to where you're not late as well. So if you could start us down that, introduce yourself.
You bet. Mr. Chair, Co-Chair, and members of the committee, my name is Chad Auer. I'm currently serving as the Deputy Superintendent at the Wyoming Department of Education. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been asked to provide you with a brief history on the relationship between Wyoming Department of Education and St. Stephen's, and also give you an update on the current interactions there. But I do want to say that when it comes to the brief history, I've been watching throughout the day, and I guess for the record, I just want to point out that I've been in Wyoming for 7 years. I've been in this position since February, and I am without question the least qualified person in this room to give a history of this, the relationship of St. Stephen's. And it's certainly what I'd lack in actual knowledge. I'll say this, I'll fill in with great respect, because the staff at WDE has certainly filled me in on a lot of the history, which started in 1888, as you all know. And it started out as a Missouri Jesuit school, and then St. Stephen's became a boarding school in 1939. And then in 1975, that's when the relationship with the Department of Education or state of Wyoming began, where there was a funding issue. And in order to keep the school going, the relationship was established. So, and that will bring me to the end of my historical knowledge of this particular relationship. Folks, like I said, in the room, will certainly be able to provide much better information to you.
So Mr. Ayers,
you're going to ask me a question already. Okay, here we go.
No, I think it's important to understand that in 79, when that was created, it was created under the Self-Determination Act, as in conjunction with that. And so then that's where our tribes had, because as a Bureau of Indian Education school, but with that self-determination, they was able to have administrative control, allowed us to have a school board, to select a superintendent, governance like you would see around the rest of Fremont County by virtue of that. Had it not been a tribal operated school and purely a BIE school, they would have made all of those decisions without public input, I believe.
That is consistent with my notes, Mr. Chairman, so I appreciate that. And again, I would have to give credit to the staff on this. Yeah, so the relationship in terms of the financial piece is governed by statute, specific reference 214601. And if I could summarize it in this way, is that the state of Wyoming, or St. Stephen's School, received federal dollars. And the attempt was, or the intent was, in an effort from the state level to support the kids and the school to backfill, or on top of that, make it an equitable distribution of funds so that the students that attended St. Stephen's were on equal financial footing or support with their peers around the county. Is that a fair summation? And that financial relationship then with the Department of Education and it's the tribal council. And my understanding is that the reason for that is because funding has to go from the state to tribal council. It cannot go directly to the Bureau of Indian Education. So the tribal council served in those roles as like the community voice, the leadership, et cetera. So that relationship is also governed through a contract, and that contract has a number of deliverables along the way. So those deliverables would include reports to the Department of Education about attendance, demographic data, the courses, curricular inventory, school improvement plans, yearly budgets, reports on how the dollars are spent. Those dollars are really meant to leverage education programs directly impacting student achievement for those students. And also it talks about through the contractual relationship, the requirement to take statewide assessments and report that.
So so by virtue of the infusion of those general fund dollars, you have those deliverables is that they meet the state requirements.
Correct.
Thank you.
The things that I read. Just a brief history too about the actual dollars in terms of the funding, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, is most recently it's 1.3 to about $1.3 million annually. And that is driven by a per pupil count. Again, there's a formula to make the state's contribution equitable, or ultimately, so the students that attend St. Stephen's are on an equitable financial contribution footing as their peers in the county. A very brief update on where we're at this point is that the Department of Education, with the appropriate Attorney General, our Attorney General, is working with the Bureau of Indian Education, who last spring has taken a more assertive leadership role with the school, and we're working out the contractual relationship and again with in collaboration with the tribal council, the appropriate folks here, to get that contract up to date and renewed and moving forward. Again, it's subject to statute. So if you, question.
So I think the question that we had as this unfolded this last year is if the tribe, if it turned away from being an tribal run school, we reflected back on an Attorney General opinion, the Crank opinion, which said that you couldn't give money directly, state funds directly to a Bureau of Indian Education school. And so
Right.
if we've seen this transition back to a Bureau of Indian Education school, then how or can we provide supplemental funding as we have historically done since '79? And if I understand you correctly, we're saying that the Attorney General is working on a process that says we would use the same process, that the funding would go to the tribes. The tribes then do have the ability to direct that to the Bureau of Indian Education school.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that is correct. However, the tribal council is still, my understanding is still going to be involved in that triangular relationship.
Yeah, they would receive
Right.
the funds and disperse the funds, correct?
That's correct.
So then my follow-up question to that is, as we do that, where Bureau of Indian Education now has more control or oversight, would they be compelled by virtue of receiving this money or otherwise to still comply with the previous deliverables that you mentioned earlier?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, yes, that is our understanding, and we've had a very good, candid, open conversation with St. Stephen's leadership at this point about addressing those issues and maintaining that relationship in a way that is consistent with statute. If I could, I'd go on some of the updates that we received from the education program administrator, that staff orientation is taking place on September 12th at the school. And there may be members or officials from the school that can give better info, but students' first day is scheduled to be September 19th, coming up in September. Currently 153, possibly upward 200 are enrolled. Fall athletics have begun. Like I said, there continues to be, the conversations to get the contractual piece handled so that we can support the school according to statute. But the school also has reported to us that they are aggressively trying to fill positions. They're having success in that area. However, there are some positions, just like all school districts across the state, that are tougher to fill. So I don't have exact positions that remain open at this time, but I guess I would end by echoing what Chairman Dresser said earlier, expressing the optimism moving forward, and WDE certainly has experienced that and continues to have positive conversations with appropriate representatives. Any further questions?
Questions, committee? I have it in my head, and it really doesn't matter, but I was thinking we was right at 3 million for the biennium. So it'd be 1.5, but your numbers may be. So we funded the last, in this last budget session, we funded for the next biennium, the supplemental funding to St. Stephen's. That's the bottom line. Doesn't really matter how much it is. And so that's been approved. And then it was just a matter of the mechanism eligible to continue on was one of the, thank you. Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, for those of us that were in Fremont County and read about what was happening at St. Stephen's, I mean, the first time I saw the article, I couldn't even finish reading it. I was so angry. It took me a few shots before I finally made it all the way through. And so I think what I'm concerned about is making sure that we're respecting the fact that it is a BIE school. It's not within the full umbrella of the state of Wyoming. But from what I understand, so that it kind of prompted this question between my co-chair and I of, this funding piece, what kind of oversight we provide that's tied to that funding. And so I'm looking at that 214601D, which talks about the cooperative tribal governing body reporting to the governor and the state superintendent of public instruction. I can't recall if years ago we removed a requirement that report be shared with joint education or even select tribal, but I can't recall the history on that. So do you know if that's something that we've changed? And then maybe your thoughts on, if we were to have access to these reports, what kind of information would be there? I mean, I'm a little sad that there's nothing in our notebook from the Department of Ed on this really important topic. We don't have a memo or anything that we can work off of. So I'm just curious of what we can start reading so we can better understand that financial relationship.
Mr. Chair, Co-Chair Senator Ellis and members of the committee. Certainly, we are working underneath of our statutory requirement around the deliverables that are outlined. And but yeah, let me get back to you on that. Certainly the staff can provide more detail on that, as well as the reports, et cetera, for you, if that's acceptable to you.
So it's a little past 3 and Chad, really let me just ask this. Are we going to have any public comment on St. Stephen's? And the reason I'm asking that is if we do, I'm going to contemplate doing that real quickly so we would be done with Chad and he could head back or do whatever. So if we do, we'll maybe do that. If not, then we'll just maybe request that you get that information to us and keep us informed of how these conversations as they're completed roll out. Seeing none, I think that's where we're at then.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chad, for being here. Okay, committee, let's go to ICWA, and can we get Professor Fort on? Professor Fort, can you hear me?
I sure can. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and we're honored to have you join the Select Tribal Relations Committee in Wyoming. You're a professor at Michigan State. Your student is walking in late, and we're going to confiscate her phone from her. So if you want to give her the one-eyed glare, you feel free to do that as her former professor. We appreciate, Claire, we appreciate you providing this resource to us and Professor Fort for you doing it. We've had a brief explanation on why we're having you share with us the ICWA 101 or to the Fort version of ICWA. And if you would just kind of give us a brief introduction of yourself and how long you've been, your expertise and who you serve, and we appreciate it. And then just go into your presentation, please.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so I am Kate Fort. I am the director of the Indian Law Clinic here at Michigan State University College of Law. I'm also the director of clinics for Michigan State University College of Law. So I have both an administrative role and a teaching role here. I have been at the school. I just posted this. My first fall here was 20 years ago as a student. I was a student for 3 years, and then I've been working in the Indian law program here for 17 years. I did my first brief in an ICWA case about 15 years ago, and I have been working on Indian Child Welfare Act related work ever since that time. In my clinic, I operate with the support of KC Family Programs, the ICWA Appellate Project, where we represent tribes in complex ICWA litigation, which just means when a case goes up on an appeal and a tribe needs assistance, we do the research and writing and representation of the tribe in that. We've represented tribes. I always make a joke. I have a student in my clinic right now who is a tribal member from Washington. She came to law school in Michigan to work on an appellate case in Ohio on behalf of a tribe in Washington. So I think that we're here to talk about state ICWA laws. They involve families all over the country and cases all over the country, which is why they're so important. I wrote the book American Indian Children in the Law, Cases and Materials, because I teach American Indian children in the law, and there was no book on it. So I wrote the book, and I've written a number of articles on that. Most recently, I do represent the 4 intervening tribes in the Holland v. Brackeen case, which we can talk about a little later, that is currently in front of the US Supreme Court. The briefs have been filed on the side of the federal government and the tribes in support of ICWA, and the oral arguments in that case will be held November 9th. Basically, all I've done is ICWA for a really long time. So now people call and ask me for information and advice, and I do the best I can. So I was here. I really like, questions and comments. So if there's any point where I'm going and the committee needs to interrupt me and tell me to slow down, please just let me know. I'm happy to do that. You asked for.
So Professor Fort,
Yes,
Fort,
sir.
I think we'll ask the committee to wait to write down their comments, just because we're doing this long distance. I think we'll just write down our questions, and on conclusion, we'll try to answer questions.
Okay, great. That sounds great. Thank you. I was asked to talk a little bit, just very high level, about ICWA and what it does, and why states are passing state ICWA laws, and then briefly what the implications of this Supreme Court case might be and what's going on there. So the Indian Child Welfare Act is a federal law that sits on top of certain state proceedings. You have to have 2 things to have an ICWA case. One is an Indian child, which is defined in the law as a child who is either a tribal member or is eligible for tribal membership, and also the biological child of a tribal member. You also have to have what the law calls a child custody proceeding. There are 4 of those. Very briefly, those are a foster care proceeding, a termination of parental rights, a pre-adoption placement, and an adoption. And if you have those 2 things, one of those 2 things, an Indian child and a child custody proceeding, you have an ICWA case in state court. Our child welfare systems are primarily driven congressional policy through the Social Security Act. So Congress changes the Social Security Act and says, for example, we would really prefer it if you'd give services to families before a child is removed, rather than placing a child in a group home situation. And they pass something called the Families First Act. It goes into law in the Social Security Act, and then states change their state child welfare laws because that's tied to federal funding, Title 4E and Title 4B, which is how Congress usually exercises its policymaking in this area. ICWA is passed in 1978, and it's prior to Congress really using that spending clause power in the same way. And so it sits separate and apart from state laws, and was and is why sometimes it can be hard to see federal policy in child welfare, which happens all the time, but ICWA is very easy to see because it doesn't sit in the Social Security Act. ICWA provides additional protections for Native families, children, and tribes to ensure that when those families find themselves in a child welfare proceeding, every state calls them something different. We call them abuse and neglect cases here. Some states call them children in need of aid cases. Whenever you're in that situation where the state has had to step in to provide some protection for the child, to potentially provide services to the family or remove the child from the home and place the child in relative care or foster care, ICWA provides a layer of protections that sit on top of that regular process. These include what we call active efforts to rehabilitate and reunify the Indian family. So if a child is removed and the parents have very specific needs, a lot of people don't know this, I think, because of the way a lot of child welfare is covered in the press, but something like 95% of all child custody, foster care, child abuse, neglect proceedings are neglect, and they're due to issues of chemical dependency, alcohol dependency, or mental health issues, as opposed to a very small percentage of cases actually involving abuse or even severe abuse. So in these cases, when we're talking about ICWA cases, we're talking about making sure that families receive all of the services they need to stay together. ICWA also requires the state to tell the tribe through a notice requirement that their children are involved in a case in a county. It allows the tribe to intervene as a party. There's an intervention of right in there. It requires the state to find what's called a qualified expert witness, which is preferably someone from the Indian child's tribe who goes to the court during the foster care proceeding or the termination of parental rights and says, actually, yes, we agree. This is not, the tribe agrees that this is the appropriate action for the state to take and not some kind of cultural misunderstanding as to why the child was removed in the first place. It also provides for what we call heightened burdens of proof. So when a child is removed from the home, the state has to prove up to a standard of clear and convincing evidence that the continued custody of the child by the parent is likely to result in serious emotional or physical harm to the child. When there's a termination of parental rights, it requires a beyond a reasonable doubt standard that the continued custody of the child by the parent will cause that harm. It basically just makes sure that states are properly removing Native children from their homes. And this is passed in 1978 because at the time, Congress holds all of these hearings in 74, 76, 77, and 78. We have hearings and legislative testimony that demonstrates, and a group that collected a great deal of data from state agencies that demonstrated that as many as 25 to 35% of all Native children at that time had been removed from their home and placed with non-relative placements. What we know today is that while ICWA works, we still see a disproportionate number of Native children being removed from their homes than non-Native children. And in fact, accounting for their presence in the population, Native children actually still have the most disproportionate numbers of removal than any other group of children. And Native children who first encounter a court are 4 times as likely to be placed in foster care as their non-Native counterparts in the same hearing. A lot of times, and then the last thing I'll say about what ICWA does that I think is really, really important is that when a child does have to be removed from the home, when you place that child, ICWA privileges or wants the state to place a child with an extended family member, if the child's in foster care, with a foster home that the tribe agrees, approves, license, or specifies specifically. If that home isn't available, then a home that the state has licensed that is a Native home. And then there's a 4th preference for a group home that's run by a tribal organization that we don't use very much. When a child then moves to what we we use the word permanency for a lot of things. So permanency can either be a reunification back with the family, or it can be a move to termination of parental rights and adoption. And an adoption in that case, the placement preferences are an extended family member, a member of the Indian child's tribe, or a member of another Indian tribe. And so the goal is essentially to make sure the child stays in their community, stays with family if at all possible. ICWA does not have any preference for either a native or non-native family. The goal is to keep child with family, which we know is the best practice and outcome for all children, and is actually policy now for all children for agencies to first look for what we call a kinship placement before placing them in stranger foster care. And so those placement preferences really force the state to work with the tribe to try to find those placements for the children. And if after due diligence and the court finds that they have looked and there is no placement, then there's always a what we call the good cause valve or good cause exception that allows a court to place a child outside of those preferences. So the preferences are just that, their preferences with good cause exceptions. And then finally, ICWA gives us guideposts for how to handle jurisdiction in cases when a child is on tribal land or on a reservation. The tribe has exclusive jurisdiction. When the child is off the reservation, the tribe and state have concurrent jurisdiction, but either a tribe or parent can ask the case to be transferred back to tribal court and to allow the tribal agency to handle and the tribal court to handle the case. If a parent does not want to go to tribal court, they have the option to essentially veto or say, no, we don't want to transfer, we want to stay in state court. And if that's the case has to stay in state court. And then finally, there is also a good cause exception in the jurisdictional determination as well, which is usually something along the lines of an inconvenient forum argument, that there is not good cause to transfer the case to tribal court because it's across the country and the tribe can't mitigate that distance. So that's a lot on how, and also makes a lot of assumptions on how our child welfare systems operate. They all operate fairly similarly with an initial phone call, investigation, potential removal, a foster care proceeding that takes under federal and state law between 12 and 18 months before we have to move to that permanency, which is either a reunification, a guardianship, or a termination of parental rights. And so you have an entire state law system that governs all that. And then ICWA sits alongside that. We consider it in most states, it's called a dual burden state. So the judges have to follow both the state law and ICWA. When ICWA does conflict, it preempts state law, but most often, most states are able to sort of apply them simultaneously. So in my state, in Michigan, we have a different burden of proof for when you remove a child. We also have a best interest of the child finding you have to have, and then you also have to make your, what we call now our ICWA MIFPA finding, because our state law is the Michigan Indian Family Protection Act. And so the judges make all of those findings together. It's not that ICWA is somehow creates a separate or separate court. But because ICWA was passed in 1978, and because our child welfare system has changed really quite dramatically since that time, there are parts of ICWA that can cause confusion and can cause problems when you're trying to incorporate it into your state systems. So my experience was back in 2010, 2011, our court improvement program here in the state of Michigan, which is every state has one and they're funded by the feds to try to improve the quality of your child welfare systems. Our court improvement program decided to move forward with working with the tribes in our state to start drafting a state ICWA law. And I was on that committee and I was extremely skeptical. And I always say this, I have people laugh at me. I have no problem saying I was wrong. I was extremely skeptical about the project of a state ICWA law. I thought, well, we have a federal law. This seems extremely duplicative. This seems like duplicative work. And I'm not sure why we're doing this. But it was what the tribes wanted. And as my former student there knows, my mantra is if the tribes I'm a tribal attorney, and if that's what they want, then I will figure out a way to make that happen. So I worked on that for the next couple of years, and we passed the Michigan Indian Family Preservation Act in 2013. I would say that since that time, so we're now coming into our 10th year, not quite, but almost. This January will be 10 years. Our judges are a lot better educated. We don't have what they call continuing legal education credits in Michigan. Once we graduate law school, we don't actually have to have continuing ed, which is not great, but we do have places that have judicial education, and MIFPA is now taught in the judicial education. I now train appellate court judges on the Michigan Indian Family Preservation Act. We had an initial spate of appeals, and then since then, I'd say that our appeals, as compared to other states with large tribal populations, Native people, has really dropped off. It's pretty clear here when the ICWA's requirements or MIFPA's requirements are required. We wrote a special piece addressing guardianships, which was specific to Michigan. We needed to deal with our estates and probate code and incorporated ICWA's protections in there. We were able to make ICWA very state specific for us and then incorporate it in with our child welfare system. And I have found that, and I think our tribes would agree, that it's actually been a much easier practice since then. There are, including Michigan, there are about 10 states that have what I call comprehensive state ICWA laws. They include Michigan and Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Oklahoma, Washington, Oregon, and California. New Mexico just passed one this past year. So a lot of states with large Native populations have these state laws. I find it a lot easier to practice in those states. I've practiced a lot in Washington state on appeal with tribes, as compared to my experience when I have a case right now in Ohio, where we do not have a state ICWA law or any federally recognized tribes. And it is all I'll say is it is an uphill struggle on that case. And it's really clear that the judges haven't had a lot of education in this. So I am now actually a really big promoter of state ICWA laws. I think they give a state an opportunity to ensure that the protections that ICWA stands for are incorporated into state law. Both ICWA and the federal regulations around the Indian Child Welfare Act say that ICWA is considered a federal minimum, that was always the understanding, was these were federal minimum standards, and that if any state incorporated protections that were higher than that those state protections would be the governing law. And so there's all these opportunities for us to kind of think creatively about how to ensure parents, children, and tribes receive the protections of ICWA while also incorporating those into state law. And I would just note, kind of along the lines of my own practice, we find very little issue. You know, I don't say not my tribes, but the tribes in my state that I'm close to, particularly say our Potawatomi tribes in Southwest Michigan, have very little issues with the counties they're right next to, right? Those counties and those tribes know each other. Those agencies get along. They may have some agreements, they may not. I don't get any calls from the tribes in Southwest Michigan about cases that are happening in Southwest Michigan. I do get calls from those tribes about cases happening in Florida, right? Or in other states. And that is where a lot of the issues come up, and where I think state ICWA laws can make a huge difference, both in the education of the judges and also protecting children who are maybe in your state from another state, or who are from your tribes, you know, in Wyoming, but are in a different state. If they're in Michigan, they receive the protections of MIFPA, and I think make for a smoother and more stable experience for the families going through a really tremendously difficult situation, no matter how you cut it. So those are my thoughts. I also wanted to talk very briefly about sort of what does this mean in the context of the Supreme Court case that is pending at the U.S. Supreme Court. And that that is a good question as to what that is. Right now, Texas and 3 foster families filed a case that challenged the constitutionality of ICWA on, we're just going to focus on the 3 main areas that they're challenging. And I'm only mentioning these because they directly go to the question of, is a state, should you have a state ICWA law? And I think, I obviously think it's a good idea, but this is why. So the first thing that that Texas and the foster families are arguing is that Congress doesn't have power to pass this law, that Congress's Article 1 power to legislate on behalf of Native people is very limited, and limited, in fact, only to actual commerce because of the way the Indian Commerce Clause is written. And as such, Congress doesn't have the power to write laws that would be about family law, which is traditionally the area of the states. And so Congress's power to pass ICWA is very limited, and states should not be bound by that. So that's argument 1. The second argument is that ICWA is in fact a race-based law, and that particularly the second definition of Indian child, a child that's eligible for membership, but the biological child of a member, that is an impermissible racial classification. This is one that's harder because this one is truly contrary to anyone who's gone to law school and done Indian law for this long. This is contrary to about 200 years of precedent and understanding of the political relationship tribal people have with their tribal nation, and then that tribal nation to the federal government. Because it has until this moment always been described as a political relationship, laws that are rationally related to the government's trust responsibility on behalf of Native people are only subject to a rational review, right? Are only subject to, is this rationally related to Congress's goal? ICWA in particular in the front of the law has 2 different findings and a purpose section that tie it specifically to Congress's trust responsibility. I don't know what's going to happen in the context of this question, other than to tell you that if the court finds that Native people are suddenly a race-based determination rather than a constitutionally defined political relationship, we have a lot of problems with all of the Title 25 of the US Code. So every law that affects Native people and tribes could become suspect very quickly with that kind of a ruling. So I'm just pretending like that's not going to happen. So we have Article 1, Congress doesn't have the power to do it. We have an equal protection argument. And then finally, we have the anti-commandeering argument, which is the argument that when under the 10th Amendment, states reserve to them all of the things that are not explicitly discussed in the Constitution. That means that Congress can't pass laws that impermissibly commandeer states or force states to enact a federal scheme. Like I said at the beginning, the way they get around that in child welfare is that it is attached to the spending clause or a spending clause hook. ICWA isn't under the spending clause, and so there's an argument that ICWA is a federal scheme that's impermissible to impose on the states. If the court finds that there's not Article 1 power or that it's an impermissible commandeering, state ICWA laws will remain safe. State ICWA laws, states can't commandeer themselves. If your state decides to pass a law that it ensures the protections of ICWA are in state law and not just federal law, that is not commandeering. It doesn't fall under a commandeering analysis. That law would remain in place. If Congress doesn't have the power to pass ICWA because family law is traditionally a province of the states, then again, you're in very safe territory with a state ICWA law because you're the state passing a law about family law and Native people in your state. Again, the equal protection piece is its own part. I think it's why, every tribe and Native person I know is extremely nervous about this case. We don't know what's going to happen. I do think it's relatively unlikely that the Supreme Court is going to upend sort of this much federal Indian law, that it would be truly very disruptive in a way, but it's hard to say right now. for that reason, right, state ICWA laws are going to protect and ensure that the protections that exist now continue. It provides guidance to your state agencies. I think one thing that is really hard to explain to the Supreme Court is sort of how much work has been built up around ICWA generally, whether you have a state ICWA law or not. Agencies and tribes have been working together, you know, coming up with agreements, coming up with policies. There's different ways that agencies will work with tribes and with Native children and families. And I just think there's going to be a lot of confusion one way or the other when this case comes down. And I'm a little nervous that it's going to be a really complicated, maybe a good thing. I don't know. I'm just nervous all the time about what this opinion is going to say. So we will get a decision. The best we can say is that the end of the term is June. So by June 2023, there will be a decision in this case, and we'll know more then. I think we'll have to analyze state ICWA laws under that decision. But that's kind of the 25,000 foot level overview of both of those things. So I'll pause now for questions or comments.
Thank you, Professor Fort. Chairman Ellis, you've got a question?
Thank you. And thank you for that presentation. I think you hit all the big points. So I guess the first question I have has to do with the task force that you served on that you said you were a little hesitant to be involved in. You know, sometimes those efforts are led by the feds, sometimes by state legislatures, and sometimes by tribes. Did your tribes in Michigan lead that effort to ask the state to be involved, or was that more of a state driven, your governor or the state legislature asking for that group to come together?
So the way that worked was, since that's a court improvement program, that program sits at the state Supreme Court. And so it's kind of run by our state judges. As I understand it, the request was the tribes wanted a more training for judges, and the court improvement program was trying to find ways to work with tribes. And so they created a tribal subcommittee of tribal court and state court judges and attorneys and representatives from the tribe. And when we first came together, they decided they wanted to do actually an ICWA, sort of a bench book for Michigan judges. So we went through all of the Michigan court cases on ICWA and what had the case law held over, 30 plus years of ICWA at that time. And we wrote the bench book. And when we wrote the bench book, it became kind of clear to both the tribal participants and the state participants that it would be really, really useful to incorporate that case law and federal law into a state law. So we had it all together. I do think that I have lots of feelings about this. I think in states where there are federally recognized tribes, that the process for writing a state ICWA law, it is imperative that you have representatives from the tribes there and agreeing that this is a process they want to move forward with as well. I remember talking to Utah at one point. There was a really great Native woman on their court improvement program in Utah, and they really wanted to do a state ICWA law. And I said, the thing in Utah is we have a lot of adoption attorneys there that just are often filing challenges to ICWA. And so you need to know if the tribes are ready, because if you have negative press about trying to do a state ICWA law, the tribes kind of get hit with that, right? And so you need that tribal buy-in, like, yeah, this is what we want to do. In that case, they were like, maybe we'll just set voluntary adoptions aside and only work on child welfare, there's a lot more agreement on that side. And they were working on that. So I think for all sorts of reasons, it's absolutely vital to have a group come together. So in that case, it was our judges, tribal judges, state judges come together and started moving that forward. That was a long answer. Sorry, I'm a professor.
No, thank you. And then just one follow-up question, Mr. Chairman. So I know it's convenient to say we don't want to look at the race-based argument, because that really, if that happens, I think all of us won't know what to do. We'll throw our federal Indian law books away and then have to start over.
Yeah.
But I think, months ago, I would have said that would never happen, but I think we all just saw what happened with Castro Huerta, and who knows what's on the horizon. So part of me says, why don't we just wait and see what happens when the Supreme Court does decide this? And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that approach or any advice.
Yeah. I think that it takes longer than most people think to even get one going. And so if you just started the very initial meetings, like sort of the temperature in the room, like, is this something that people would like to do? What do we think is important? Should we have a few meetings on that? I will tell you that the Uniform Law Commission, which is the group that helps, that drafts uniform laws for state legislatures to adopt if they want, has agreed to start a study committee on a state model ICWA or a uniform ICWA. The study committee is because they wanted to start hearing about state laws, but they're not ready to do anything, obviously, to draft until we hear from the case. And so I think that makes sense. It takes a while for everyone to come together and decide it's something to do. I would totally understand holding off drafting, for example, until you get a decision down to understand it. That said, you know, if you were able to get something in law before it comes down, you may stave off a little confusion and instability with your agency. It's just really hard to say.
So can you help me remember, as I've read through some ICWA material, if the child, let's say, is one parent is non-native, the other parent is an enrolled tribal member, and the child is a non-enrolled member, does that child then fall or qualify for the conditions of ICWA?
It would
if they're not
depend.
enrolled?
It would depend on if they're eligible for membership. So if the tribe says, oh, they're not a
Okay.
member yet,
Okay.
but they're eligible, then they would follow.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then the reference, you know, its memory serves me correct, if when this proceeding comes, if there's an action for protection of this child in Wyoming, it would come before the district court. The district court would then consider whether it should be moved to tribal court. But if the tribal court's a distance away, I mean, is it the tribal court of that falls within the state, or is it the tribal court for which the enrolled member belongs to? Can you clarify that up for me?
Sure. Jurisdiction's always an interesting one on this. So the district court would have an affirmative obligation to determine if that court has jurisdiction. So like if the child lived on a reservation, or if the child was what we call a ward of the tribal court. So the tribal court is already exercising jurisdiction over this child, and for some reason the kid has now popped up in state court, it would still be the exclusive jurisdiction of the tribe. When the tribal court is some distance, it is the tribal court of the Indian child. So wherever that may be. Now, this is where it gets a little interesting. If you have a child on a reservation who is a tribal member of a different tribe than that reservation, that tribe there would still have jurisdiction over the child. ICWA says that any child living on, any Indian child on a reservation comes under the exclusive jurisdiction of that tribe. And then that's an intertribal conversation. When a tribal court is some distance away, it can really depend on the facts. And that's usually when, if a tribe or a parent requests the case be transferred, the state court has to go through that sort of inconvenient forum analysis. I'll give you an example of one that I just completed, the one in Ohio, and the opinion is public, so I can talk about it. The mom and the child were in Ohio. The tribe was in Washington. All of the child's extended family were in Washington. The child stayed in Ohio for the year while the agency worked with the mom toward reunification. The mom was unable to address her chemical dependency, and the state was moving toward a permanency or a termination of parental rights. At that time, the tribe and the parent asked the case be transferred back to the tribal court in Washington, where the child's aunt was. Everyone agreed that made a ton of sense. They transferred it. So that's a case in which it's a really long distance, but it made a lot of sense because the child was going to be in a guardianship, a long-term guardianship with his aunt on the reservation. What happens a lot is when you do these kind of inconvenient form analysis, just here in Michigan, we have a lot of families in Detroit. The tribes are up in the Upper Peninsula, about 10, 12 hours away. During that process, when you're doing reunification, it's really hard to transfer that case so far away from the parents because there's an obligation to try to do reunification. So there is an inconvenient forum analysis that the district court would do after a request by the tribe or parent to transfer the case to the child's tribal court.
You also mentioned, and I apologize, I don't get, you're giving poor Senator Ellis a break from all my questions on this stuff.
Okay.
So as I was reading some history on ICWA, it appears that there has been a time or two where the two parents did not want the child to be placed with family, and the tribe has interceded and been granted, I don't know what the right word is, but then interceded and was able to still maintain a jurisdiction, maybe is the right word, over the placement of that child back with tribal family or with in tribal members, contrary to what the two parents is that depend on state to state? How does that work?
That is, I think it's first really important to distinguish between sort of voluntary adoptions, where you have parents who are voluntarily giving up their child and picking where they want to place that child to live, which does fall under ICWA, but tends to be analyzed differently. And the questions of sort of what are the parents' rights to choose that placement versus the child's right to her connection to the tribe and the tribe's right to the connection to the child. That's a very knotty, as you might imagine, a very knotty issue and set of rights that come in conflict. We do know that in the first case that the United States Supreme Court heard on ICWA, it was a voluntary placement, but it actually in that case had to do with the fact that the parents lived on the reservation and they were subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of the tribal court. And that when they left the reservation briefly to have the children and place the children for adoption, they did not suddenly become domiciled in Mississippi. They were still domiciled on the reservation. And that was in fact a jurisdictional question. And the court said, this is tough, but the tribe has exclusive jurisdiction here. You can't kind of evade tribal jurisdiction to evade ICWA. The question of like a truly voluntary adoption and how that works, that is one that states have, there's lots of different cases and it's very fact dependent. On the other hand, the question of if you have two parents who have been found by the state to not be a fit placement, right, to not have that they themselves are not able to care for the child, then I have found that courts do, first of all, that's why the placement preferences are there. And if the tribe and the state agency and the judge all agree that the best placement is with a relative, even in that context, if you have a parent saying, well, I don't actually want the kid with a relative, the parent has already lost some of the rights in their bundle of sticks because of the fact that they're unable to care for their own child, right? That they're in the system with the agency. The question of whether parents retain that bundle when it's a purely voluntary adoption and they're putting the child up for adoption, I think is still what we call an open question. It is why some states have decided, Oregon, for example, decided to not address voluntary ICWA cases when they passed their state ICWA law, and because they could all come together on these agreements about children in foster care. I will say one last note that the federal regulations that were passed in 2016, when we talked about sort of that good cause valve for not following the placement preferences, the first one is this is transferred. The first one is what would the child's parent want? So a court is supposed to take into consideration the child's parent's request, regardless of if it's a voluntary or involuntary proceeding.
So I think for when we're around people that are really legally intelligent, as you clearly are, and you're trying to explain this to somebody that digs ditches like I do, that I get a little bit lost. And so I really need to because I hear you and Senator Ellis talk about this, the race versus the political piece. I think we really need to understand that better. And so I want to, if I'm understanding right, if the individual comes before a court, in this case, it's because of they're a sovereign, and they're part of a sovereign, meaning they have, then as they, even though they may be away from their county or their state or whatever, that does not take away from the fact that they belong to this sovereign. And so then they have rights due to them, not as an American Indian, but a sovereign member of that tribe. Am I getting that even close?
Yeah, that's basically it. It's that the decision of tribes to determine who their membership is an inherently political decision, right? So every tribe in either its constitution or its laws says, these are who we consider tribal members. This is how you can become a tribal member. This is how we deal with tribal membership. And there will be people who are racially American Indian who do not meet the definition of the tribes that they are descended from, don't meet their membership requirements. And so when you think you can be both racially American Indian and then politically a tribal citizen. And so it gets really confusing sometimes because we measure things a lot of times, like our census, for example, right, measures American Indian as a race. It doesn't measure tribal citizens. It says, are you an American Indian? And people can say yes. And then that's how we get that number. But the number of tribal citizens are people who are exactly right, politically a member of a sovereign nation. And that sovereign nation has made the determination, these are who we count as our citizens, that's the political piece. And it's tied, I always think of it as like a two-step. The federal government has a political relationship with federally recognized tribes. Either they signed a treaty or they said they agreed that, yes, we have a government to government relationship. And then that tribe has that same sort of political relationship with its citizens. And those citizens of federally recognized tribes that is all a political designation. And the way, again, we know that is that we know, well, we all have, I mean, I don't know. I have friends who are racially American Indian, but for all sorts of reasons, don't meet the requirements of the tribal citizenship that the tribe themselves set when determining their citizenry. And those tribes, like you said, sovereign governments that have that government to government relation with the federal government.
How about that? Go ahead, Cinderella.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm sitting here and I am stuck on this question of how this kind of happened for you in Michigan. You know, you mentioned that it really started in the judicial branch. You had tribal court judges and your state judges coming together. And then you mentioned, I think 10 other states have state ICWA laws. I'm curious if you know kind of the origins of how that all came together. I mean, were they started with your judicial minds and then brought to your legislatures, or if you were following any of those developments? I am kind of curious what you observed.
Sure. I can talk somewhat reasonably about Oregon and New Mexico, which are the two most recent ones. Oregon started in their legislature. They had I don't know if the woman who took the lead was herself Native. I think she was. And they started a committee. A good friend of mine was her staffer on that in committee. And they did very similar thing. They brought they invited every tribal representative, so tribal agency worker and tribal attorney, to work groups, and they work group that through their legislative process, and they went fast because they were on their short session. So they had a hearing, they came up with language, they had meetings once a week where they went through line by line by line with all that, and they did that entirely in their legislature. New Mexico had a class is really interesting. I don't know. I think it's really interesting. There was a class action lawsuit against the agency on behalf of children, including Native children in their foster care system. And they came to a master settlement agreement. And in the settlement agreement, the judge ordered that the state adopt a state ICWA law in order to be in compliance. I know. I still am not entirely convinced that this is not crossing all sorts of branches of government power, separation of power problems, but that was the agreement in the settlement. The state then hired consultants that were not, they hired consultants and they came up with a draft, and that draft was deeply problematic for all sorts of reasons. It didn't include protections. It hadn't been vetted by any of the tribe's attorneys. I worked very closely with Navajo Nation on that one. And we were all a little surprised by that draft, and then ended up going back to the kind of the drawing board with the tribal attorneys on board and came up with a new draft. And that went through both their I want to say it was their legislative and executive branch, because they have a cabinet level position for Native affairs. And so that person was driving it, as well as a couple legislators. So I think it's actually easier if you have a process in a state that you can do it through the legislature, because one of the big things that happened to us in Michigan is we started in the court improvement program, but once it came to the point where it had to go to the legislature, none of those people, that was a power, separation of powers issue. So I was someone who could jump as a professor. I could move from doing the work of the work group and then also continue working when we were in front of the legislature. But a number of our people had to drop off, and the support staff that we had used at the Michigan Supreme Court and with the CIP had to drop off because it wouldn't have been appropriate. So that would be what I'd identify as a hurdle in our system, that we did it that way. And we really could have lost a lot of momentum if we hadn't paid very close attention to it. And I would say that even in that hurdle, there's still parts of the law that are, in my best legalese, I say are written kind of goofy. And I think it's because it didn't get a proper look-see after it went through our Legislative Services Bureau by everyone who could have taken a look and had a view on it. So if you have a process that you can do in your legislature while including all of the tribal attorneys' voices, all the tribes' voices, I think that makes a ton of sense.
I guess one more question. Have you seen any tribe lead that in any of these other states where the tribe says, we care about this? We're going to call these, members of the state judicial branch. We're going to call these legislators. We're going to call, family services for the state. We're going to call our tribal family services. We're going to lead that. And that's what I'm curious, because I'm trying to rethink this, right? To be really respectful of what that tribal sovereignty and tribal leadership means.
I think that it would be fair to say that, like in Oregon, that was essentially, there's an attorney down there for the Umatilla tribes who was pinging my Facebook. How do I get a state ICWA? Who do I talk to about a state ICWA? How do I do this? And I think Brent would take a lot of credit for getting the state moving. I think sometimes it can be really hard for tribes to get that moving in the state system. Minnesota has a pretty old state ICWA law, but my understanding of their, right now I'm on a group that's working on amendments there that is driven by their tribal attorneys. So the tribes are doing all the work on bringing the groups together and amending the law and coming up with definitions. And so I think can be a real push-pull. I think part of the problem, not problem, but I have a similar, I want to be very, you want to have all the respect for the tribes. And then at the same time, ICWA is the state's responsibility. ICWA is, frankly, a remedial law to ensure that states aren't acting agencies and courts aren't acting wrong when they get Native children in front of them. And so I do believe that ICWA has an interesting way of bridging both sort of state legislative, state agency, state courts, and tribal council, tribal agency, and tribal courts, that it's a mutual project to keep children safe and healthy. So I would say that a lot of the time, like for example, in Michigan and Washington, if the tribes weren't on board that law, they would not have passed the law. They're too powerful in those two states. If Washington tribes had come in and said, no, thank you. And in fact, it was close because there's like a lot of tribes in Washington and they can get in a lot of fights over a lot of things. And it was a close call whether it was going to get off the legislative floor. When I talked to the organizer there before we passed ICWA, we also in Michigan had a tribe very concerned about certain language. And by last minute, I mean, it was like on the floor. And we managed to address the issue and it got passed. So there were a couple different places where that was checks and balances with regards to tribal interests, and the state action were able to be incorporated. I would say as an example, there's no way New Mexico would have passed the state ICWA law if Navajo Nation wasn't okay with it. It just wouldn't have happened.
Committee, any other questions? That was a lot. It's been very helpful. Well, and I think, Professor Ford, this is for Wyoming here. We've been really fortunate just because of the agreements we've had with our tribes. We see ICWA more come into effect, as you pointed out, away from the communities surrounding the reservation. But we anticipate this is a big deal coming up, and we just are trying to get our thoughts together on how we should approach it. So thank you very much for your time with us today. You're welcome around our campfire anytime.
Thank you.
Appreciate having you. So any comments from Claire Johnson? We just want you to say, we just want you to say hi to your
Hey.
Good morning, or I guess afternoon now. Chairman Larson, as you know, the Northern Arapaho tribe really pushed to get the idea of a state ICWA law on your all's agenda. With the fact that the federal law could be struck down, we feel that it's very important. I will let you know that right now, as the tribe's attorney, I have 62 ICWA cases, both in the state of Washington and throughout the country. The Northern Arapaho tribe strongly believes in bringing these cases back to tribal court to attempt to reunify the child with their family, and if that's not possible, to place them with other members of their family or their tribe. Traditionally, the Northern Arapaho tribe does not terminate parental rights. And so the tribe likes to have the children within the tribal system so we can look at alternative solutions so that maybe we place with grandma and parents have a chance to work the system, get into a place where they can one day have their children back.
So these 62 cases, how many of them are these all out of state?
Chairman Larson, they're all over the country.
How many of them are in the state?
I don't have that number right now, but I can get it for you. Probably about half of them.
Half of, and so if we were to do a state ICWA law, it would really impact 50%.
Yes,
right?
sir.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman. So just to add to what everything that's been said here today by Professor here on Zoom, I thank her for being here, and to our attorney. As a member of the HHS Secretary's Tribal Advisory Committee, working with Secretary Azar and now Secretary Becerra, as the professor said, she stressed about this, but in Indian country, as tribal leaders, we are so worried about this, and it's because we're gonna lose our children. If we're gonna lose our children into the system, we're not going to find them until they've been adopted out. And that's just the reality of what's gonna happen if this law is struck down. So that is why we come to you today as a select committee. Let's get started on working on legislation to protect the children of the state of Wyoming. Again, it was with Northern Rappos, but we are citizens of the state of Wyoming, and we want to work together so that Indian child welfare, the act itself is protected here in Wyoming for us to serve our children and families. We've worked well. We have a long-standing relationship, the state of Wyoming and Northern Apple Tribe. I can only speak for us, but together, when we first did tribal child support, I was the tribal child support director. I worked with the state director at the time. There was a lot of education and practically campaigning to state judges and to other people within the system that this could work. And how do we work out jurisdiction? We worked out a jurisdiction matrix at the time for tribal child support. I am state director, won a national award at the time for our partnership throughout Indian country and also throughout the country. So we can do this. Let's get together. I know there is a Indian child welfare director for Northern Apple and also one for Eastern Shoshone. And so that would be a great start. And our tribal attorneys like Claire, there are great people on the Eastern Shoshone side that represent their legal affairs that we can all sit down and let's talk. And I'm glad Corin's here. I know Corin's watching this, Corin Schmidt, the state DFS director. I'm thankful that she's here today so that we can start to engage. I caught her outside, said, Corin, I love you, but we need to sit down and have a good talk. And so let's get started. I am going to be a key player at this on the tribe side, advocate for the tribal children and for the state of Wyoming. Again, let's take the lead as we always have in the past together and show Indian country and the country that we are working together on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is Shelley Buno.
Shelley and Bonu.
And who's the Eastern Shoshone, do you know?
I don't know. It was Sarah Robinson, but I don't know if she is still their director.
Okay.
Well, just Chairman Larson, if the committee does decide to pursue a bill, the Northern Arapaho Tribe is more than willing to work with you all on language and help craft anything you need.
Chairman Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think we need to really think about is who's sitting at the table and who's invited. I think there's tremendous value in having the judiciary involved. I know I don't always go to the meetings, but I've been on this thing called the Children's Justice Project, led by the courts, and there are a number of judges and people practicing, and that's all they focus on are children's issues in Wyoming. You'll recall when we worked on the absenteeism bill, that took 3 years and hundreds of hours of my life. And it has one little provision that just tried to say, we're going to comply with federal ICWA. And boy, that took 3 years and it barely passed this last session. So my reticence is like, I don't want to show up to another hearing with a bill draft and have people pick it apart because they say they weren't invited to the table and crafting it. So my preference is to make sure we, as colleagues, start interacting. Please let us know who you think should be involved in this. We're happy to weigh in. if we're finding agencies are not wanting to participate or the judicial branch, that's certainly areas where I'd be happy to make calls and say, this is important, please participate. But, I don't see this being a fast moving endeavor if we're going to do it right. And, after my experience in working on that absenteeism bill, I will tell you, it was hundreds of hours and it was painful. It was really painful.
And along with that, we want to involve everybody, but we won't have half the state on the committee. Sometimes you get a committee that just becomes too burdensome. We can evolve that. So, but we want to have the right players at the table. I've already started making a list here. So,
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Case, please.
is there some work we can do in advance in terms of maybe with the professor? I'd like to know more about the differences and, the various state ICWA laws that are out there, and if they all follow a similar structure, or are they different? That might be useful to know if we could maybe get those states and those laws and make a matrix out of them or something to see.
That's a great question. I guess in my mind, I'm seeing that the federal ICWA law being the foundation or the
probably all the
basis
same.
for what this has evolved from. But I think
I don't know.
I think that that's a fair case, because I think all of it either is impacted by that federal law or amends that federal law to, we've seen states improve and dilute federal law. So I think we have to, but fair question. So I think my feeling is committee is to, I think kind of have some conversation and then approach leadership of House and Senate on maybe creating a subcommittee or task force, whatever the right term would be, so that we could include non-legislative members as well, and then maybe have that in place like we did the State Health Facility Task Force or some of those others that would be maybe a 2 or 3 term thing and fund us for meetings, something like that. Am I seeing that differently than? And I'm not a big fan of extra committees, but
I'm not, Mr. Chairman, I'm not either, but it does strike me, if the Supreme Court's going to rule in next summer, then say they vacate the whole federal law, then we have children and concerns with people here in our systems now, and we have no guidance. So I'd sort of like to think about it. I'm not sure we need the legislation, but I'd like to be thinking about it.
well, and I think that one possibility, if that were in the event we anticipated, is that we would just say that the federal ICWA law, the state comply with federal ICWA law as it was in place until we get our state ones. I mean, I think we have options. I think your point is well taken, but I don't know that I have all those answers, but I don't know. I think yours is a great question. We don't want to leave a big hole for somebody to inadvertently fall into because of our inaction.
So, Mr. Chair, just to follow up on that, and I apologize. I'm not sure how that would work. I mean, is it a law with a sunset that says it tries to anticipate what happens at the federal level and says, if this were to happen, the state of Wyoming will continue the current practice for the next year or something? I mean, I don't know how that would work to provide a safety net. I'm trying to understand it, looking to legal advice.
Mr. Chairman, I think that the state has a bit of a model, albeit a completely different topic, but with the idea of some sort of a trigger when something federal happens that it has just experienced. That is yet to see how that will play out, but there might be a model there. And then also, Mr. Chairman, I know that if the committee wants to do a task force, that is also traditionally a bill draft.
Mr. Chairman. So this race-based discussion we've had, though, is important for this reason. So at the congressional level, Congress can't pass a law that says, we recognize that slavery was wrong. We shouldn't have enslaved African Americans. So we're going to give a hiring preference to Black Americans today. When you do that, the courts say, wait a minute, that's a race-based classification, and they apply this heightened level of scrutiny, and they say, you know, you've got to have a really good reason for this law, and is this going to cure the problem you're hoping to fix? And when you have that kind of loose explanation, we feel bad. We want to right a wrong of the past that usually doesn't quite meet that threshold. So the courts generally strike those down. But because of Native Americans have this sovereign status, then they apply rational basis. So the federal government can say, we want to apply a Native American hiring preference within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And that's completely legal. So that's what's at stake here, is if the Supreme Court somehow finds that that political classification no longer applies and it's just race-based, then we can't just mimic the federal law, because then it really just takes it all away. So that's why there is some value in trying to wait and see what happens at that level. Are we just putting a Band-Aid on it? If they say Congress lacks their Article 1 power, or this is commandeering, then we can fill in the gaps and I think make some good progress. But if that second piece, then it's, I mean, there's going to be massive chaos in the world of like rewriting federal Indian law. So that's my only hesitation about jumping in. I do think maybe for our next meeting, if we work with, you know, our tribal partners and identify a possible task force, I think there's tremendous value in that, and who should sit on that, how much we would ask for an appropriation so people's travel costs are covered and things of that nature. That seems appropriate to me.
Have it on the list. Anything else? Would you like to say goodbye?
I want to say thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you. Thank you. Good work.
Good to see you. Hopefully I'll see you in November.
Well,
For Tika?
For Tika, yeah. Come on out to East Lansing. It'll be great.
Yeah. Well, thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor Ford.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. Have a good evening.
Please. Councilman Harjo.
You know, here we are talking about our children and their future. I feel like they don't have a voice. They don't have a voice in this. And they're the ones that are affected by what we're going to do and the actions that we're going to take. And I really want us to move on this because we have children that are waiting. They're waiting to see what kind of life they're going to have. They're waiting to see what kind of future they're going to have. They're waiting to see who they're going to be with. So all of these children are still on hold while we're making up our mind. So I just like you to think about that and that we need to start moving on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, committee, we've got two remaining things that I'd like to go to. Mr. Redmond has been patiently here. He was first one here this morning, fixed me breakfast, and appreciate him. He's the education representative for, and has some concerns and comments that he'd like to make to us. And then following Mr. Redmond, we'd like to hear from Terry Dugan, who is going to report to us on efforts PBS has been making on their education components for us. So Terry, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. This is going to be brief after the last speech was done. Yeah. We're going to talk about the grades and the truancy and absentee report from the state. The grades have been low ever since the last 30, 40 years. Then they haven't increased. And so there's something wrong. And I talked to my daughter this morning, and she's a teacher, and I was a teacher, and we had a lot of absenteeism. And that's what caused a lot of kids to not to, well, to study, I guess. But so some of them just go out for sports. When the sports season's over with, they just quit school. And that's been a problem. We need somebody to select State Department to come and talk to the administrators and the parents And we have to, it's hard trying to get the kids to go to school. And when I went, I had perfect attendance 1 year, but you know, it's pretty hard for anybody to go to school. Because a lot of times they don't you have nothing to eat. We used to joke about what we had for breakfast, biscuits and gravy. And so it's all they have in the mornings. Then it's pretty rough. Getting the kids' grades, they've been low since, like I said, 20, 30 years, and this new act that the Senate passed. It's Senate number 0031, and the consequences for the parents on that is they have to put 10 days work in the area where they well I mean, yeah, that 10 days work in some area, but who's going to be the supervisor? That's the other thing, because a lot of these programs don't have person to carry on that program. And there's our dropout rates are high. And our graduation rates are low, and it's pretty hard all around. And we need somebody to. I tried to call some meetings, but nobody shows up. And the committee, we're trying to get together, and hopefully we try to invite the governor's members to come up here to talk to them, but I haven't got a response from them. It's been about 2 months since I wrote to them, and never wrote back. And I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know who's going to talk to the kids or the parents, because we can't. I don't know whether they'll listen to the governor or what, but it's like some teachers here in Merton asked me how they can teach some kids. They said some parents come out and pick up their kids 3 to 4 times a week, and that's every week, and that's that's quite a while. And they asked me to come and speak to them, but I never did get a response from them. And I don't know what the problem is. I wish we knew. If we knew the problem, we wouldn't be here. Here's kind of thing, see.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman. I'm on the Arapaho Tribal Education Committee that Alfred heads up, and we have concerns about the low grades that we see on the statistics of the state's evaluation. And we know that those students aren't dumb. You could put them on top of the mountain and they would survive. They know how to do that. But sometimes in the classroom, that doesn't work as well. So we're looking at all avenues to make things happen more correctly. The Arapaho tribe has a truancy ordinance, and we enforce part of that. But as administrations change and the court has changed, it seems to have fallen between the cracks on enforcement. So we don't want to get in a beastie situation with parents, because we need them to have their students, but at the same time, they need to be responsible as well. and get their students to school and keep them in school. So it's a multifaceted problem, but I think it's also a multifaceted way to get things done, solutions. So Alfred has been very patient and we'd like to see better grades and, we need to see as much interest in education curriculum as we do in the sports arena. But granted, of the last few years, we've got Indian education for all in the state. That's a really big step. There's a lot of it going on here with some of the curriculum being developed by tribal leaders, tribal educators. So it's probably too early for the curriculum to let us know what's going on, but maybe it'll help. But in the meantime, we have students that are going through the system and they're not getting any kind of an education that'll sustain them in society, which means it's a cost to all of us. So I don't know, we have our Indian Education Days every year, and there's different solutions from different tribes in different areas about incentives to go to school and stay there. But we just want to make you aware beyond what we already know that you do with what we need to do. And we're looking for opportunities. I know Bob Black has been very instrumental in putting things together for us, but now we have a superintendent of education that would be hopeful to be scoping in on the tribal education system. So that person doesn't have to be ground up all the time in terms of a learning experience. We have our own concerns, of course. St. Stephen's still has students. We know there's administrative problems there. We think we're going to take care of those. But at the same time, we don't want our students to fall between the cracks any more than they do now.
There's been education conferences the last 30 years and it's been going on, but it still hasn't improved the Native Americans' grades or opinions. And it's been there a long time. I hope it wasn't there, we wouldn't be here.
I might add, Mr. Chairman, those low grades that we see in the data are down in the 20s and 10s and single digit responses. So it's not even a gap. There is a gap between the lower producing schools throughout the state, and then you get to the reservation schools, and it's just a substantial change. I don't know if the testing is wrong. I don't know if the students don't know how to take the test or the teachers don't prepare them. I don't know, but it looks pretty bad.
Thank you. Chairman Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we're not supposed to pontificate, but I would just offer this. So joint education, we've been looking a lot at reading scores and the importance of early literacy. So maybe you and I can visit offline, but that's one thing that has come up is, are we using the right screening tools to identify readers who maybe have some reading difficulties, things like dyslexia? Are we teaching teachers how to teaching reading and literacy effectively? And so this is a huge focus of us, but often what comes up is you'll have your high performing school districts in Wyoming that say, we're fine, leave us alone, don't change anything, don't mandate anything, because we're high performing, everything's fine. And the example I always use is look at our reservation scores. This isn't okay. We need to be doing better. So we just really encourage you and I to visit offline and then start, participating in those joint education hearings, because this bothers me more than you know. And I think you and I are probably on the same page. Like we've got to be doing better.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Collins, please.
Earlier today, I met with Craig Doherty up in Sheridan on a Zoom call. And evidently he's in process with the governor on some educational concerns. And I think it's RIDE, R-I-D-E. So, we would hope that he would somehow focus some of his efforts in our area. Obviously, the governor is searching for the solutions too.
Committee members.
Okay, I tried to get a perfect attendance award. And I called all the schools in the last couple of years, and they didn't have any of them at perfect attendance.
So, Mr. Redmond, you've invited us and we've met different times, and I will just thank you for being a champion for our young people and understanding the importance of education. I'd like to say 2 or 3 things that we've worked on or done it, but that I just don't think we should. I just think we should listen to you and get to work and keep working. It doesn't matter what we've done. It hasn't worked thus far. So we just need to keep our boots on and get at it. And you've got this committee's commitment to help where we can. And I'll reach out to the governor's office for your request as well.
Okay.
And we'll any suggestions you have that this committee can help with, we're willing to do and assist.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Okay.
I saw you reaching for your gavel.
Please, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairperson, Madam Chairperson, thank you. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to give you my annual review of the work that Wyoming PBS and our Native American educator partners are doing on the Wind River Education Project. As you know, this project was originally funded by the legislature approximately 8 years ago. For the last 3 years, it's been funded by Wyoming PBS as part of our mission of service to the state. Because I was a last minute addition, unfortunately, my notes were not in your packet. You have them, and I've also provided them electronically. I've also provided you with a copy of one of our most recent lesson plans. This was developed by one of our Native American educators. We have currently 19 videos, learning objects available for use in the classroom. We have 63 lesson plans split up between the 4th, 8th, 9th, and 12th grade. 29 of them are written by Eastern Shoshone educators and 34 by Northern Arapaho educators. When this project was started by my predecessor, we made a pledge to the tribe that all lesson plans would be developed by Native American educators. We did not want to find ourselves in the position of trying to teach to the tribes what they live. I believe we provide the tribes the opportunity to teach others about their culture. The lessons are available nationally on the website that you've got, wyomingpbs.org learning media. That PBS learning media website is available to teachers across the country. And in fact, the second most used state, if you will, the state that uses our content, the second outside of Wyoming, is Texas. I don't know why, but we're certainly glad to provide the teachers of Texas with these outstanding educational materials. There's notes down there on some of the presentations that we've made. We've got a minimum of 4 videos in production. One of the topics that we're looking at is a discussion of the difficulty of the tribes in receiving the right to vote in America. When we produced the video State of Equality, we touched on this very briefly, and I mean very briefly, like a minute, 30 seconds briefly, about how delayed, how much of a delay there was in providing rights, voting rights to Native Americans in this country. So that is something that we hope to expand on. We're also working with an educator to develop a learning module on Paleo Indians, especially those that were in the Wind River Mountain, the Wind River Range. And we are working with educators to develop lesson plans on the Path of Honor exhibit that is on the reservation. It has been one of my passions for my 7 years as general manager. I've worked with 7 tribes in 5 states on language and culture preservation projects, and this is something that is dear to my heart. And we are very, very pleased and very proud to partner with both tribes to provide this content to Wyoming educators and educators nationally. And again, that's a very brief summary of our work over the past year.
So, Mr. Dugan, my question has been is, do you have a feel of how the school districts outside of Fremont County, I mean, are we seeing this migration and use of this work that we feel is just critical to help our citizens of the state understand the contributions and the impacts and the lives of our Native American neighbors?
Mr. Chairman, a brief bit of housekeeping for the LSO. I'm Terry Dugas, General Manager of Wyoming PBS. That's an excellent question. And I've always said that from my interpretation, these lesson plans and these learning objects aren't necessarily designed for reservation teachers. They live this. They've been teaching this for years. What we have done is provide them with some learning objects, some videos, which can be used in the classroom, and some structured lesson plans. But to me, this content is really designed for the rest of the state. It's for the educators in Tinsley and in Kimmer and in Rock Springs and in Du Bois, who don't necessarily have access to Native Americans. As Mr. Redmond mentioned, can't always call up a tribal elder and ask them to come to your classroom and talk about the culture of their tribe. Unfortunately, we don't have district by district usage of these. We know that, for example, nationally, these videos have been viewed over 140,000 times. There's been 44,000 different users of these, this classroom material, but I can't tell you if that was from School District Fremont 25 or if that was from Rock Springs. We just don't have any way to identify where it's being used. We do know, in working with Rob Black and the Department of Education on the Native American Education Conference over the last 6 years, that our presentations given at these conferences are always well attended. For example, at the one that was held this August, we had about 35 teachers attend our 2 presentations. Of those, half were outside of the reservation, outside of Fremont County. So teachers are being exposed to this content. The real issue is always going to be, you know, I've got 154 different things to teach. And it's up to the administrators, it's up to the instructional designers, it's up to the individual teachers to decide, this is important in my classroom. That was why the very first module that we created was, why bother? Why should we teach Native American history? And teachers are being beset with countless other potential topics. The Department of Education itself is focused on computer learning now. So I wish we had more teachers using this. That's why Michelle Hoffman, our project coordinator, has focused to some extent on educating educators, not necessarily the teachers. We want to make sure the administrators, we want to make sure the instructional designers are aware of this content, because that's where it's going to filter down. If a principal, for example, or a supervisor says, you know, this really is important material, we need to cover this in the classroom, that gives the teachers the necessary motivation and frankly, the necessary cover to say, we're going to focus on Native American education and we're going to focus on the Indian Education for All Act that was passed by the legislature. Now, and that's my soapbox and I apologize. That's all right. It's French. It's not, it's French. It's not Irish.
Thank you for updating the comments. Curious how well that's permeating across the state. I think we've been like that for education. Any questions?
Thank you for the opportunity.
I'm sure you look at correctly. If I can get something. No, I think, we talked, Kevin, we talked about the, law. Thank you, Madam Chairman. So we're looking at a possible bill draft if we need it, and then to inquire from state agencies, probably Highway Patrol, on the need of on the ability to implement that without legislation if we don't need it. Like to have a letter, Heather, go out to Secretary Holland, I believe, and then include our congressional delegation, which will send to these local representatives, because we get it to our delegation easier rather than send it. But in the letter to Secretary Holland, if we could go back and look at the letter that we had crafted earlier on the law enforcement disparities, particularly the compensation, and we had urged her to adjust that to be similar to what other Department of Interior law enforcement officers and positions are. And then we wanted to look at express to her the challenge that we have when we have somebody apply, the length of time it's taking for background checks and security checks. Express concern about when we do get staffed up on our law enforcement agencies, that then they take them, and what was the word we used, to send them out someplace else? What? Detail. Send them out on detail into that the negative impact detail plays on an agency when they it's almost as though they're being punished.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
And then let's not forget the trigger, it's a 3-year position, but they lost 6 months just doing the background check. A request that the start date is that's when the 3-year period starts.
Is that making sense to you?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have that documented.
And so, my good co-chairman, are you seeing that differently than me, that we send that to Secretary Holland and then, okay. Yes.
But back to the Ashanti law, I think, I'm not so worried about the necessity of whether the agency can or can't do it. I think we should probably just have a bill draft prepared.
Okay.
And then along those lines, something clarifying, I don't think we have the silver alerts which are for senior citizens. We might just include that, and then we can evaluate whether or not we're missing something additional, like a blue alert, which is, I know, for law enforcement. But I think a bill draft would be appropriate.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Do we need a motion for a bill draft?
Mr. Chairman, no, you can simply direct me to do that. Mr. Chairman, I did have the opportunity to look at whether Amber Alerts and the other alerts are by name authorized in statutes, which they are not. However, this committee's legislation from a couple of years ago, which encouraged cooperation and among law enforcement, still did not name them by calling them Amber Alert, but it suggested the type of the alerts. And so just for direction, because Amber Alert and then the one that is already exists but not yet in here are not named, are you wanting Ashanti and Silver Alerts named, or just the type of mechanism that the way that it was addressed in the previous legislation was by going through the organization or the
I think
mechanism that
historically
allowed
we've
it.
avoided organizations with
Okay.
names, but defined by what they do. But if you feel differently, that's okay.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, and then one of the things that we found when Ms. Chambers and I were looking is the legislation from a couple years ago did have a paragraph that legislation under law enforcement duties, highway patrol duties, actually, that's where it created this requirement for coordination among law enforcement agencies. And that did include a paragraph that said the state highway patrol may also use or manage other alert systems to aid in the safe recovery of missing or endangered persons. And it could be that that is sufficient, Mr. Chairman. So would there be leeway in this request for a bill draft to also not be a bill draft, depending on what we find?
Let's plan a bill draft and we'll review that.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I think it'd be helpful to have the bill draft to nudge and get a position from the agency, so that might be helpful.
We talked about the medical pathologists, and I got a little clarification from our county treasurer. It looked, so we're going to use medical pathologists. We heard from Jessica that for help on the autopsies of some of these individuals when their bodies are recovered. And we heard that in Fremont County that they contract with a medical pathologist. I found out that contract ended as our recent coroner, that's a responsibility that comes through the coroner's office. And as coroner's changed, he discontinued that. And so that looks to be ebbs and flows. And so the intent, I believe, from the Labor and Health Committee would have those as permanent positions available to the county as available, and probably the clearer path. And so I don't know that there's any more that we need to do there. Madam Chairman or members of the committee, is there anything more we want to do on this concurrent jurisdiction on wildlife matters, or do we want to just reach out to the Game and Fish and Game and see if they have any recommendations? It sounds like that they're working pretty well together, but maybe get their input before we move forward.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I thought it was pretty funny that, funny in a sort of tragic way, that our Game and Fish said, well, maybe you should pursue cross deputization with the sheriff instead of with us. And, you know, we've been trying to get it through Fremont County Sheriff for a decade. You know, so I would love to have a formal law enforcement arrangement at some level with some entities just to prove that it would work. And we've never had good success through the sheriff. So I'd rather keep pursuing through these agencies.
So, but I think that we need to work with tribal Game and Fish. That's
totally.
Okay. Very
Yeah,
good.
and I think it also, this Herrera case, we're going to be having to work together as agencies down the road anyway. So I figure if we can encourage this relationship, it might pave the way for that.
Would like to craft a bill to create an Equitech task force. And, you know, open for suggestions on that. Having served on a number of those task force, I think we have to be a little bit careful that we don't try to stack them too high. Of course, we'd want representation from legislature, House, Senate, Judiciary, either Supreme Court or District Court, and DFS. Then each of the tribes. is there somebody that we're missing here? Kara or Director Schmidt, anybody that, Councilman or Chairman Dresser, any Councilman Harjo, anybody, is there another group that we feel should be in there? You know, we can play with the numbers. Madam Chairman.
Mr. Chair, I think, you know, I'd like feedback from the tribes of who they think would be helpful from their perspective on there. I think we've got to be a little fluid and flexible in how the bill draft comes together. And just, you know, when we have this meeting in October, be prepared with amendments if we've got too many people, not enough people. You know, and I am curious to know where Eastern Shoshone is on this, if they like this notion of a state ICWA law, recognizing the sensitivity about any potential of it being viewed as a state law being imposed on the reservation. I've been hearing that all day today and I'm sensitive to it. I'm listening. So just want to make sure we understand their position.
Very good. And so, Heather, this would allow for the creation and members funding and direction on chairmanship and things like that. So if you kind of get a rough draft, we can start playing with that and then we can work it in our next meeting.
And Mr. Chairman, you know, this is something I'm literally just thinking of as I sit here now. I think we have some more thinking and work to do on the revenue discussion we had on sales tax. So I don't know if that similarly would maybe be like a bill draft for a task force of the right people to talk about revenue options or what to do with state sales tax collection on remote sales. I'm just sitting here totally spitballing this, so you can tell
I'd
me it's
rather
a
keep it
terrible
in the
idea.
committee.
Okay. I just don't want to let it get off the agenda, so.
I'd rather keep it.
We need to keep
We've got the
thinking about
background
it.
now. I just keep it here. Please.
Bring up another issue.
Sure.
I don't know about you guys, but Ms. Swallow's testimony this morning was pretty powerful. And I could just see this, we've had a big effort on missing and murdered. And but it was overwhelming that, and watching the interaction between her and the law enforcement, I could sort of understand why there's kind of a problem in the sense that when these assaults are reported, or they're kind of these women are victimized. Okay. I mean, it sort of was pretty obvious to me, and I might be overreading into it, but I don't think so. And I don't know how to deal with that, but it was very powerful. And it's like, wow, they need someone in their court when they're going through this. And I don't know how we get there, but I can see law enforcement's got a huge bunch of stuff to do. The witnesses are uncooperative. They've got a lot of calls, but there's just a lot more there. And I can just see how fearful these women are when they go back in the community and the perpetrators are still there and they're at the regular events and they're terrified. So I don't know how to break through this, but I'm not done talking about this, that's for sure.
Mr. Chairman, since we're just kind of having this free discussion, so I know Senator Case knows I worked on that Indian Law and Order Commission, and we had an entire chapter talking about crime in Alaska, and what happened up there was, you know, substance abuse. Sometimes bad things happen like rape or molestation of children. And because of how Alaska's set up, they would have to call a state trooper. And sometimes because of weather, trooper would take 1 or 2 days to get there. By the time the trooper gets there, people have sobered up, and the perception in the community was, well, don't say anything because you're taking the perpetrator, who's a family member who provides, you're taking him away for justice that's happening in a different city in Alaska. We never see what happens. We never hear the testimony. So they rally around the offender rather than the victim. And to your point, it was tragic to hear these stories. And so, you know, to a different degree, I think we heard some of that today is, you know, when justice isn't local, I think there might be a fear of just having that perpetrator fall into the federal system to be prosecuted, maybe in Casper or Cheyenne or away from the community. So I agree with you. Her testimony was compelling. I think we're going to talk about missing murdered Indigenous persons again in October. I don't have a thing to bring up for that meeting in particular to address what we heard this morning, but I would agree with you that that's not unique. And sadly, there's a lot of things to be thinking about. And I don't know how to change that cultural problem.
So I, during our break, I approached Miss Swallow and have set up a tentative meeting with her because I think I'd like to get, I just think it was really difficult for her to be here. I think she, you know, was just a very brave act because how is everybody going to perceive what she's saying? And she goes toe to toe with us, toe to toe with everybody that's sitting here saying, come what may, I've got to get this off my chest. And so I think we need to be just a little careful of not, I'd like to follow up, I guess, on that on a more personal with some appropriate people, maybe another person or two there with her to see if we can discuss this a little bit more, and then maybe in October have some suggestions from that conversation on what we could recommend as a starting point. I just I'm want to be and I don't think that anybody's suggesting that we have her come back in and make suggestions. I'm just trying to protect her and protect what she said just a little bit. Kara, in fact, you may be the person I get to join me.
No, well, yes, I'm happy to join. But who I wanted to suggest is my office was contacted by Kimber James Tower. She's the Executive Director, Tribal Victim Services Unit with Wind River Family and Community Care System. And so she's fairly new to this area, but she's been very eager to engage with the state system and other victim services across our state. And we've tried to work with her. I would suggest that the committee invite her. Because she's trying to work with this community. She is new to the area and I don't know what connection she's made or hasn't made. And perhaps Chairman Jesser has other suggestions, but I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to help try to understand that bridge that we encounter frequently with sexual assault victims and law enforcement. And the dynamic that you saw here plays out frequently. But I would suggest, and I can give Heather Ms. Jane Towers contact info, because I do think you need to hear from more of the boots on the ground than myself. Yeah, I can send it to you as well. Yes.
I guess what I'm saying is I'm just kind of walking carefully on this, but I think that we're all on the same page that we have to, and these issues don't get pretty. They don't get any prettier until they get resolved. Okay, Councilman Fast Horse.
Yeah, Chairman, one thing that we're willing to do after this, what we heard this morning, was to again talk more with the BIA about adequate training, you know, for our officers that is more specifically tied to this topic. Because again, one sense that we've always heard and witness to is the fact that when these officers are doing their jobs, that they actually, in a sense, because of not enough training in that area, that they are victimizing the victim even more, you know. And so we want to get a deeper dive with the BIA, whether it's locally with the chief of police, but also with the superintendent, Leslie Shakespeare, and also the area office, to find out what kind of training regiments or what are you offering your officers now, as far as what's coming in the future to help prepare these officers. Because again, as it was stated by Chief of Police Blackburn, is that they're waiting on their advocate specialists, you know, within their department. But it's like, well, you guys should all be advocate specialists. You know, you should all have enough training within your own capacity to do more, because that's where we see a lack of. And again, regardless of how many officers we have, it falls back on that all the time. And so it's like, well, how do we push to, again, get more? And I think that's where we as the leaderships of the two tribes could possibly be more effective, is really pushing that envelope with the area office and making sure that they are following up with us and producing some results in our ask. So that's kind of how we're looking at it.
And Mr. Councilman Fasthorse, I'd also appreciate maybe some guidance from each of the tribes on how we with you support some really tough decisions that law enforcement might have to make. And how we're saying in a unified manner that these types of actions are not condoned or accepted in Wyoming. And
We agree.
right, and so how do we, and I know that this is all collectively, but as you guys have these conversations on how further training for law enforcement, would you also please consider then how we join with the two councils to say, no, we're firm on this. This is unacceptable.
Right. And
This
this
is
is uniform.
unacceptable.
Yeah, across.
Yeah.
I agree. And then also Chairman Dresser has some information that he's been trying to get to bring to us that Montana is doing in their aspects to helping with the network and the overall coordination of tracking and things like that. So we may have some other suggestions to bring forth by that time of the next meeting. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
So why couldn't we chat with local sheriffs and chiefs of police in different towns to find out what they're doing about these victims, these women victims? How are they handling it? Maybe we can get some insight on what the BIA needs to do, or maybe that'll help them. They should be at our next meeting and somebody in October.
Mr. Chairman, along those lines, there must be some best practices, guidelines that I'm looking at. Yeah, that we ought to be able to bring to the committee. And then maybe find out what agencies are using those, and they may not even be Wyoming agencies, and maybe try to bring that into the committee. Share it.
While you were out running around sloughing. Okay, you're the one-eyed glare here, First Tribal Relations Committee, and you're getting a detention. No. Yeah. So when we heard from Mr. Redmond, and he had some concerns about some serious concerns about education and in incentivizing or trying to encourage parents and children to go to school. And he said one of the things that he had hoped to do was to invite the governor to come and maybe speak to members of the community on the importance of education, the importance of having kids in school, and the importance of the future of Wyoming. And he says he hasn't heard back. So can you take that assignment and see if the governor could maybe, if he'd be willing to come and meet with the parents and the teachers and students, and I don't know all the details. I think maybe ask, we could reach back out to Alfred.
Well, and Chairman Larson, we received an email and a couple letters from Mr. Redmond, and we have responded to those letters. We've said the governor would be happy to consult with him or speak with the group that he represents, but that it has to go through the tribal council first. Just because it's been the request of the council that we direct those policy matters through the council. So that would just be my one point is I want to make sure I do that correctly through chairman and the Northern Arapahoe Tribal Business Council.
And you'll do that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just wanted to follow up. Perfect. Still not taking back the one-eyed glare.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think that there's anything we've missed. There are a couple individual things to do, which we will follow up with individually, you and Senator Case individually. Mr. Chairman, I believe it's October 18th at the University of Wyoming in Laramie at Co-Library.